Hey everyone, and welcome back. If you clicked on this video looking for something creepy to relax to, fall asleep to, or just enjoy late at night, you're in the right place. Our goal is to reach 1,000 likes and 100 comments. So if everyone watching right now leaves a like and writes a comment, we can definitely make it happen. It really helps the channel. Now sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the stories. My name is Owen Larkin, and what happened to me in 2012 at Chickasaw National Recreation Area, Oklahoma, still wakes me screaming some nights. The limestone springs that morning steamed like the breath of something buried deep, and the coffee smell from the campground carried on wind that seemed to whisper warnings in a language I didn't understand. I reported for dawn patrol, expecting the usual bureaucratic headaches. Stray campers who'd pitch tents in restricted zones, boat launch arguments over who had reserved which slip, maybe a snake bite from someone who thought flip-flops were appropriate hiking gear. The Park Service radio crackled with its familiar static symphony as I loaded my truck, checking equipment with the methodical precision that comes from 15 years of dealing with people who think nature is as predictable as their suburban backyards. My partner that day was Dana Willis, a rookie ranger fresh from the academy who still believed rules mattered more than instinct. She bounced in the passenger seat like a caffeinated squirrel, humming some red dirt country song I'd heard bleeding from every truck radio in 3 counties. Her enthusiasm grated against my morning mood like fingernails on limestone. "Do we really need rifles for a lost dog call?" she asked, watching me secure the weapon rack with the kind of disapproval that comes from textbook training. Her voice carried that particular pitch of authority that only people who've never faced real danger can manage. "Anything with teeth comes out at sunrise," I told her, checking the safety on my service rifle. "Including people." The weight of the weapon felt comfortable in my hands, familiar as an old scar. Dana rolled her eyes with the confidence of someone who'd never seen what panic could do to supposedly civilized humans. The dispatcher's voice crackled through static that seemed thicker than usual, distorted by interference that made simple words sound like threats. A father and his teenage son hadn't returned from a night fishing expedition along the North Shore line. No cell signal back there, rough terrain that ate inexperienced hikers like candy. The kind of call that usually ended with dehydrated tourists nursing wounded pride and mosquito bites. We logged the call and grabbed trauma kits that felt heavier than usual, medical supplies that suddenly seemed inadequate for reasons I couldn't articulate. The service road stretched ahead like a tongue of cracked asphalt, disappearing into scrub brush that grew thicker and more aggressive with each mile. Our tires crunched limestone gravel that sounded like breaking bones, and pecan branches slapped the mirrors with increasing violence. As if the forest resented our intrusion, Dana split off to search the creek bed where drowning victims usually surfaced, her footsteps fading into the morning mist like footprints dissolving in sand. I followed the bluff trail toward Three Sisters Springs, a limestone formation that local tribes had considered sacred until European diseases and bullets convinced them otherwise. The trail markers grew sparse and weather-beaten, Park Service efficiency giving way to the kind of neglect that happens when budget cuts meet bureaucratic indifference. I found their tracks easily enough. 2 sets of prints, adult and youth, dragging a cooler through grass still wet with dew that seemed reluctant to evaporate. The trail was clear as highway signs, leading toward an unmaintained bison fence that park staff kept meaning to remove but never quite got around to. Budget meetings always pushed maintenance lower on the priority list, leaving relics like this fence to mark boundaries between civilization and something older. Past that fence line, the park turned genuinely wild. No restrooms designed by committee, no maps mounted on posts by contractors who'd never walked these trails. Just switchgrass that grew tall enough to hide bodies and hidden sinkholes that opened like hungry mouths in the limestone substrate. The kind of wilderness that reminded humans they weren't really in charge of anything that mattered. The prints ended at a ring of flat stones blackened by fires older than the Park Service. Someone had built this circle before regulations and permits, back when fire meant survival rather than citation-worthy offense. I found their cooler nearby, lid snapped open like a broken jaw, fish inside untouched and beginning to cloud with the milky film of death. The sight sent ice through my veins for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature. A Zebco fishing rod lay splintered against limestone, destroyed with the kind of violence that suggested rage rather than accident. The reel still dripped water that seemed too red in the morning light, and the line stretched into brush like a spider's web waiting for prey. Something had hit that rod with enough force to snap fiberglass designed to fight 100-pound fish. I tried to radio Dana, keying the mic with hands that had started trembling without permission. Static hissed back like something laughing, electronic interference that seemed almost organic in its malevolence. I tried again, adjusting frequencies and checking connections, but the radio responded with silence thick enough to drown in. The air suddenly felt different, oppressive with the weight of storm clouds despite clear skies. Atmospheric pressure that made my ears pop and my teeth ache, as if the sun had been replaced by something that only looked like daylight. I pressed forward, calling names that echoed back, distorted. Syllables rearranged into patterns that sounded like responses from things that shouldn't have vocal cords. Mr. Harper? Tyler? My voice carried through morning air that seemed to swallow sound instead of carrying it. Only wind answered, whipping grass in broad, nervous waves that moved against the breeze, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. 50 yards ahead, a life vest fluttered on a cedar trunk like a prayer flag left by people who'd run out of prayers. The orange nylon was slashed in long parallel rakes, each groove about the width of human fingers but deeper than fingernails could cut. Whatever had made those marks possessed strength and claws that belonged in nightmares rather than Oklahoma wilderness. The discovery sent adrenaline through my system like poison, fight or flight responses firing in patterns I'd thought training had eliminated. My service weapon felt inadequate against threats I couldn't identify. Technological solutions to problems that predated technology by geological ages. A muffled pop echoed from Dana's sector, her sidearm delivering one deliberate shot that cut through morning air like a period ending a sentence. The sound carried implications that made my stomach clench with dread, professional instincts screaming warnings I wasn't ready to hear. I ran toward the sound, lungs burning with exertion and terror, rifle ready for targets I couldn't imagine. The radio continued squawking electronic gibberish, then went silent with the finality of death, leaving me alone with sounds that belonged in places humans weren't meant to visit. I crossed terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and spirits in equal measure, forcing my way through ash saplings that grabbed at clothing like desperate fingers. The trees grew too close together, branches interlocked in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than natural growth. Everything felt deliberate, as if the forest had rearranged itself according to rules I didn't understand. The old CCC stone shelter emerged from vegetation like a gravestone marking civilization's failure. Built during the 1930s by men who believed hard work could tame anything, it now stood as testament to nature's patience and humanity's arrogance. Dana's boot prints circled the entrance in patterns that suggested confusion or panic, overlapping tracks that told stories I didn't want to read. Blood dotted the flagstones in a neat arc, each drop spaced with mathematical precision as if someone had carried a measuring cup full of crimson liquid. The pattern was too organized for accident, too deliberate for coincidence, suggesting methodology that made my skin crawl with implications I refused to consider. I drove my shoulder against the iron gate, expecting resistance from hinges rusted by decades of neglect. The metal groaned in protest but held firm, secured by chains that should have snapped under pressure but somehow maintained their grip. I tried again, putting my full weight behind the assault, and felt something give way with the sound of breaking pottery. The shelter ran 30 feet into limestone darkness, ending at an overlook window that faced a sheer drop into geological time. It smelled of bat guano and wet dust, organic decay mixing with mineral persistence in ways that suggested things living and dying in cycles older than human memory. My flashlight beam cut through darkness thick enough to feel, revealing stone walls that wept moisture despite the dry morning outside. I found Dana's flashlight rolling across flagstones worn smooth by generations of feet, its beam strobing against walls like a disco ball in hell. The light created patterns that seemed to move independently, shadows dancing in ways that suggested presence rather than absence. Her ranger hat lay crumpled nearby, crown dented as if something had stepped on it with considerable force. But Dana herself wasn't there. Something shifted in the rafters above, creating sounds like burlap sliding over bone with purposeful rhythm. I tilted my flashlight beam upward, cutting through darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 2 amber rings blinked once, twice, then vanished like eyes closing in sleep, leaving me with the impression of intelligence watching from spaces too small for anything large enough to have eyes. I chambered around with movements made automatic by training, the mechanical sound echoing through stone space like a death knell. Whatever lived in those rafters understood the implications of that sound because the shifting stopped immediately, replaced by silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. A rock clattered behind me at ground level, limestone fragments striking stone with deliberate timing. I spun toward the sound, rifle ready, but my flashlight beam revealed nothing except drifting chalk dust that moved in patterns suggesting recent disturbance. The dust particles danced in my light like snow falling upward, defying gravity with casual disregard for physical laws. I felt watched from every corner, scrutinized by attention that crawled across my skin like insects exploring territory. But the corners remained empty of anything I could identify, filled only with shadows that seemed slightly too dark and dust that moved with too much purpose. Then came a new sound that froze my blood in patterns of ice. Hollow breathing, close enough to feel on my neck, timed with my own respiratory rhythm but offset by half a beat like an echo that hadn't learned proper timing. The sound suggested lungs designed for different atmospheric conditions, adapted for breathing something other than oxygen. I backed out of the shelter with movements made clumsy by terror, feet finding the path by muscle memory while my conscious mind gibbered with implications I couldn't process. Outside, morning light felt thin and inadequate, sunshine that seemed filtered through something that absorbed wavelengths human eyes needed for comfort. I keyed the radio with hands shaking badly enough to make fine motor control impossible. The antenna knob broke off in my fingers like candy, plastic components failing under stress they'd been designed to handle. Electronic equipment betraying me when I needed it most. Technology proving inadequate for situations it hadn't been programmed to address. Movement rippled through grass downhill, too fast for deer, too low for human beings, creating patterns that suggested something serpentine, but far too large for any snake native to Oklahoma. The displacement moved with purpose and intelligence, tracking parallel to my position while maintaining distance that suggested strategy rather than coincidence. The sun climbed higher in sky that seemed reluctant to brighten, yet shadows pooled in defiance of physics as if light refused to penetrate certain patches of reality. Temperature gradients that made no sense, microclimates existing in spaces too small to support them, environmental anomalies that hurt to think about directly. I scanned for Dana with desperation that tasted like copper pennies, calling her name with increasing volume and decreasing hope. Nothing answered except blue jays that scolded with voices that sounded almost human. Avian vocabulary expanded beyond natural limits to include syllables that belonged in human throats. I called in a mayday on the truck's console radio, keying the emergency frequency with movements made awkward by adrenaline overflow. Dispatch started to respond, professional voice cutting through static with reassuring authority. Then the line died mid-word as if someone had cut cables with surgical precision. The engine wouldn't turn over despite perfectly maintained mechanical systems. Something thumped on the roof with deliberate rhythm, then skittered across metal surface with sounds like fingernails on sheet steel. I bolted out the passenger door with rifle leveled toward threats I couldn't identify. Professional training warring with terror that made thinking difficult. A smear of dark fluid striped the cab roof in patterns too organized for accident, warm and sticky when I touched it with fingers that came away stained with something that wasn't quite blood. The substance carried odors I couldn't identify, organic compounds that suggested biology operating under different rules than anything I'd studied in academy training. The smear led to the rear bumper and vanished in gravel that showed no signs of disturbance. A dragging trail with no visible dragger. Physics violations that made my head ache with incomprehension, evidence of presence without proof of passage, contradictions that challenged fundamental assumptions about how reality operated. Training kicked in despite terror that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Establish perimeter, draw fire to gauge threat level, maintain tactical advantage through superior positioning and firepower. Academy protocols designed for human adversaries facing human weapons, inadequate for situations that transcended normal categories of danger. I loaded a flare with movements made automatic by repetition, the phosphorus charge sliding into the launcher with mechanical precision that felt reassuring despite circumstances that defied reassurance. The red comet arced skyward like a prayer made visible, burning trajectory cutting through morning air with desperate hope for human response to human distress. For a moment I felt sane, connected to procedures and protocols that made sense in world governed by physics and logic, emergency signaling that worked because people understood cause and effect, technology designed by humans for human problems in human environments, until something threw it back. The flare landed 10 yards away, still burning with chemical fire that shouldn't have survived return trip through physics that apparently didn't apply here. As if an invisible pitcher had fielded my distress signal and returned it with casual contempt for human emergency procedures, demonstrating capabilities that made my weapons feel like toys. I heard dry chuckling ahead, no human laugh but something like wind through reeds played by intelligence that understood humor in contexts I couldn't grasp. The sound carried implications of vast amusement at human presumption, entertainment derived from watching creatures struggle against forces beyond their comprehension. Grass parted in a V advancing toward my position, displacement pattern suggesting something large moving with predatory purpose. I fired a warning burst, muzzle flash cutting through morning air with technological authority that should have impressed any natural predator. The grass stilled immediately, response suggesting intelligence rather than instinct, but the chuckling echoed behind me now, acoustic impossibility that placed the source in multiple locations simultaneously. Sound bouncing off shelter walls and car hood to triangulate my position while staying invisible, using echo points to map my location with sonar precision that belonged to marine animals rather than terrestrial predators. I realized it was hunting me with capabilities I couldn't counter, technologies biological rather than mechanical but far more sophisticated than anything human engineering had achieved. Predator evolved for environments I couldn't imagine, adapted for prey that included humans but wasn't limited to them. I sprinted toward the springs where people should be. Families with children swimming in limestone pools under supervision of adults who believed civilization extended to places they visited on weekends. Better lines of sight, witnesses to whatever was happening, safety in numbers that had protected humans since we'd learned to travel in groups. My boots hammered the path with rhythm that sounded like drums announcing arrival to audience I didn't want to meet. Cedar branches whipped my arms with increasing violence, vegetation responding to my passage with hostility that seemed personal rather than mechanical, the forest actively resisting my movement, trying to slow me down for reasons I didn't want to understand. I broke into the picnic clearing expecting to find families unpacking coolers and setting up grills, normal people doing normal things in daylight that should have been safe. Instead, I found abandonment that told stories of panic and rapid departure. Coolers left open with food half consumed, towels flapping like surrender flags, radios still playing to empty air. The midday picnic crowd had fled so recently that engines were still ticking as they cooled, cars abandoned in positions that suggested their owners had been in serious hurry to leave, sandwiches with single bites taken, phones ringing with calls that would never be answered, portable chairs still warm from human contact. At the waterline, I found footprints leading into the spring but none coming out. The limestone pool looked placid and inviting, turquoise water clear enough to count pebbles on the bottom 20 feet down. Paradise designed by geological processes over millions of years, natural beauty that should have inspired peace rather than terror. Yet the water carried faint pink swirls and eddies that moved against current patterns. Impossible to miss against the turquoise background. Color that suggested recent contamination with organic material, biological processes occurring underwater where visibility should have prevented concealment. Across the pool, something knelt on a boulder with posture that hurt to look at directly. Gaunt and tall, with limbs proportioned incorrectly for human anatomy, elbows positioned higher than its narrow head in configurations that violated basic structural engineering. Skin modeled like river rock but with texture that suggested life rather than mineral formation. Surface patterns that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. It held Dana's radio, with hands that possessed too many joints, chewing the rubber antenna like a dog gnawing antler with methodical persistence that suggested nutrition rather than nervous habit. Its eyes reflected water's glare in jets of silver that hurt to meet directly. Optical systems designed for different light conditions than anything terrestrial evolution had produced. The jaw distended sideways with mechanical precision before spitting plastic fragments into the basin, demonstrating anatomical capabilities that belonged in engineering textbooks rather than biology classes. Mandible systems adapted for purposes I couldn't imagine, designed by evolutionary pressures that had never applied to anything I'd studied. I froze with rifle barrel drooping toward ground, professional training conflicting with visual evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Academy instructions said aim center mass, but my brain whispered that center mass on that thing was wherever it decided to put it. It turned its elongated head with movements too fluid for vertebrate anatomy, studying me as if considering trade possibilities. Intelligence behind those silver eyes, consciousness operating according to logic I couldn't access but could recognize as systematic rather than instinctual. This wasn't mindless predation but calculated evaluation. Then it slid off the rock without creating splash disturbance, disappearing under surface like oil folding into water with physics that made no sense. Displacement patterns wrong for solid objects entering liquid medium, surface tension responses suggesting the thing possessed density properties that violated basic material science. I raised the rifle with movements made clumsy by terror, tracking ripples that moved in patterns suggesting multiple objects rather than single source. The disturbance split into branches, one circling left and one right, converging behind my position with coordination that demonstrated tactical intelligence. I fired into each wake with automatic responses trained into muscle memory, bullets punching through water that should have provided resistance to high-velocity projectiles. The spring erupted with violence that sent geysers 20 feet into air, hydrodynamic forces that should have displaced anything hiding beneath surface. Yet nothing surfaced except bubbles that carried odors of decay and sulfur, chemical signatures suggesting biological processes occurring underwater in absence of oxygen. Instead of results, reeds behind me snapped with sounds like breaking bones, vegetation destruction that indicated presence of something large moving with deliberate intent. I whirled toward the sound with weapon ready for targets that remained invisible, combat instincts firing in patterns designed for human opponents using human tactics. Empty space mocked my readiness, revealing nothing except disturbed plant matter and air that carried scents I couldn't identify. A scream erupted from the camping loop to the west, boyish and high-pitched with terror that resonated in frequencies that made my bones ache. Human distress call that triggered every protective instinct evolution had programmed into social species, demanding immediate response regardless of personal risk. I sprinted again with lungs burning from exertion, an atmosphere that seemed too thin for proper oxygen exchange. Each breath carried metallic taste that suggested environmental contamination, air quality degraded by processes that belonged underground rather than surface level. I found Tyler Harper crouched behind a bathroom block like prey animal seeking shelter from predator too large to fight. Blood covered his life vest in patterns suggesting defensive wounds, hands clamped over ears as if trying to block sounds that came from inside his skull rather than external sources. His eyes held the unfocused glaze of severe psychological trauma, consciousness partially disconnected from reality too terrible to process completely. His father lay inside the doorway face down, with back cleaved open like fish fillet prepared by expert hand, spine gleaming white through muscle tissue separated with surgical precision. The wounds suggested tools designed for butchery rather than hunting, anatomical knowledge applied with clinical efficiency that belonged in medical textbooks rather than homicide scenes. Tyler's eyes locked onto mine with desperate intensity, recognition struggling through shock and terror to establish connection with another human being. But he made no sound beyond shallow breathing that suggested respiratory systems struggling with atmospheric conditions they weren't designed to handle. I grabbed his collar with hands that shook badly enough to make fine motor control difficult, pulling him behind the block while checking for wounds that might prove fatal before we could reach help. Shock symptoms but no serious injuries visible through blood that belonged to his father rather than himself. Vital signs suggesting survival was possible if we could escape whatever had done this. I slung him over my shoulder with movements made awkward by gear and terror, feeling his weight as a reminder of responsibility I couldn't abandon regardless of personal risk. The ranger station lay half a mile south, the only brick building with locking steel doors designed to keep dangerous wildlife outside civilization's boundaries. The path ran straight through terrain that should have provided clear passage, but every 100 feet a tree fell across behind us with timing too precise for coincidence. Ancient oaks and hickories crashing with sounds like artillery fire, sealing our route with obstacles that would take chainsaws and heavy equipment to clear. Something wanted a corridor, herding us forward along predetermined route toward destination we wouldn't choose voluntarily. Tactical manipulation that demonstrated planning capabilities beyond anything natural predator should possess. Strategy adapted from military science rather than evolutionary development. I heard clicks in the canopy above, joints popping open and closed like ball and socket mechanisms too large for their frames. Anatomical sounds suggesting arthropod anatomy scaled up beyond reasonable size limits. Chitinous systems adapted for weight loads that should have required internal skeletons rather than external shells. Mid-run, I felt heat on my spine like proximity sensor warning of immediate danger. Evolutionary alarm systems screaming warnings about threats approaching from behind. I ducked with reflexes trained by combat experience, pulling Tyler down with me as something massive swept through air where our heads had been. A limb thick as my thigh scythed through space with velocity that would have decapitated both of us. Driven by pale arm that vanished so quickly the appendage seemed thrown by gravity itself, rather than attached to anything substantial. Biomechanics that defied analysis. Propulsion systems operating according to physics I couldn't understand. I fired upward with automatic response trained into muscle memory, muzzle flash illuminating canopy briefly before darkness reclaimed territory above our heads. Bark exploded in shower of fragments, wood chips raining down like evidence of ammunition effectiveness, but the forest mocked my efforts by remaining structurally intact. Whatever lived up there possessed durability that made small arms fire ineffective. Armor systems biological rather than manufactured, but superior to anything human engineering had developed for personal protection. Natural selection producing defensive capabilities that exceeded military technology through processes operating over geological timescales. I reached the station porch with lungs burning and muscles screaming protest against sustained exertion under stress conditions that pushed human endurance beyond design limits. Keycard ready with movements made automatic by repetition. Electronic access system that should have provided sanctuary from threats that belonged outside civilization's boundaries. The door beeped red denial with sound like electronic death knell. LCD display showing system failure that meant safety lay beyond reach. No power to electronic locks despite backup systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of failure. Technological breakdown occurring at moment when technology was most needed. The generator should have kicked on automatically, diesel engine starting with reassuring mechanical reliability that proved human engineering could be trusted in emergency situations, but silence suggested sabotage rather than mechanical failure. Deliberate system compromise by intelligence that understood human dependencies on electrical power. I smashed the glass panel with rifle butt, sacrificing equipment integrity for immediate access to shelter that might provide tactical advantage. Tyler crawled over shards with movements made clumsy by shock, glass fragments that could cause infection but posed less immediate threat than whatever hunted us through morning air. In the radio room, backup batteries were stripped with professional thoroughness. Wires dangling like severed nerves from communication systems rendered useless by surgical precision. Dana's duty cap hung on the microphone stand with brim chewed by teeth designed for purposes beyond normal mastication. Fabric destruction suggesting anatomical capabilities adapted for materials harder than organic tissue. Tyler found his voice then with sobs that carried information I'd been dreading to hear. The thing copied voices, he told me through tears that left salt tracks on cheeks stained with his father's blood, lured them off trail by sounding like park staff requesting assistance. Vocal mimicry perfect enough to fool people who worked with those voices every day. His father followed the call thinking a colleague was injured and needed immediate help, professional instincts overriding caution in response to perceived emergency. Tyler stayed back to photograph birds with camera equipment heavy enough to slow their progress, hobby interest that had saved his life through simple chance. He heard his father shout with voice that carried implications of discovery too terrible to process. Human exclamation that ended too abruptly for natural causes. Tyler ran toward the sound and saw that elongated figure folding over his father's prone form, peeling flesh with methodical efficiency that suggested experience with human anatomy. The thing turned its head completely around with mechanical precision impossible for vertebrate neck structure, sniffing the boy with respiratory system adapted for chemical analysis rather than simple oxygen exchange. Olfactory capabilities that included biochemical assessment of threat level and nutritional value. Sensory equipment evolved for purposes beyond anything terrestrial predator required, but it returned to the larger meal without pursuing easier prey. Decision-making that demonstrated calculation rather than instinct. Resource allocation based on caloric return versus energy expenditure. Optimization strategies that belonged in economics textbooks rather than predator behavior studies. Tyler broke for the campground with survival instincts overriding shock, hiding behind structures designed for human comfort rather than protection from threats that exceeded normal wilderness dangers. Concealment that worked only because the predator had other priorities. Temporary safety dependent on creature's meal schedule rather than defensive effectiveness. I barricaded doors with filing cabinets and office furniture, creating obstacles that might slow whatever was coming but wouldn't stop anything determined to enter. Dragged the shotgun rack close and loaded slugs designed for large game ammunition selection based on stopping power rather than accuracy requirements. Tyler crouched behind the dispatch desk, clutching stuffed buffalo from gift shop display, childhood comfort behavior emerging under stress that regressed psychological state to developmental stages where toys provided security against monsters that lived under beds rather than in wilderness areas. I handed him water from emergency supplies and told him we'd hold position until state troopers arrived with equipment and personnel adequate for threats that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. Standard procedure for situations that required backup. Protocol designed for human emergencies rather than whatever we faced. From the roof came metallic screech of materials failing under stress loads they weren't designed to support, then tiles cascaded past windows like ceramic rain announcing arrival of something too heavy for structural systems designed for weather rather than predator weight. The rafters groaned under load distribution that exceeded engineering specifications, wooden beams protesting treatment that threatened building integrity. I ordered Tyler into the weapons locker, narrow concrete cubicle with bolt door designed to secure firearms from unauthorized access. Military surplus construction that might provide protection from threats more serious than burglary. Reinforced walls that could stop small arms fire if not necessarily claws designed for materials harder than human tissue. He scrambled inside with movements made awkward by terror. Survival instincts overriding dignity in situations where pride was luxury none of us could afford. I followed with rifle ready for close quarters combat, pulling the door toward closure that would provide final barrier between us and whatever was coming. Before I could engage the locking mechanism, fingers like sap-coated roots slipped through the gap with flexibility that suggested cartilage rather than bone structure. Appendages adapted for spaces too narrow for normal human anatomy. Joints that dislocated and relocated with mechanical precision impossible for vertebrate skeletal systems. They flexed and searched with purposeful movement. Tactile exploration suggesting intelligence gathering rather than random groping. Sensory organs located in fingertips rather than traditional locations. Nervous system distributed through extremities in patterns that belong to invertebrate anatomy rather than mammalian organization. I crushed them with rifle buttstock, applying force designed to break human bones through leverage physics that should have disabled any terrestrial appendage. They bent rather than breaking, cartilage crunching like celery stalks under pressure that would have shattered normal skeletal structure. Anatomical resilience that exceeded human engineering, biological materials superior to anything manufactured technology had developed. A hiss rattled through ductwork with acoustic properties suggesting respiratory system adapted for atmospheric conditions different from surface-level environment. Sound waves that carried harmonic frequencies designed to travel through spaces too narrow for normal vocal equipment. Communication methods evolved for environments where traditional speech was impossible. The fingers withdrew with mechanical precision, damaged tissue retracting to positions where it could heal or regenerate according to biological processes that operated faster than human medical science understood possible. Recovery capabilities that made injury temporary inconvenience rather than permanent disability. Healing systems that belonged in science fiction rather than biology textbooks. I locked the bolt with movements made urgent by sounds that suggested immediate danger. Mechanical security that might provide temporary protection from threats that exceeded normal breaking and entering capabilities. Steel mechanisms designed for human burglars rather than predators equipped with anatomical tools superior to manufactured implements. The weapons locker reeked of gun oil and dust, organic decay mixing with petroleum products in atmosphere too thin for comfort. Only one ventilation grate connected us to hallway air that carried scents, suggesting biological processes occurring in spaces designed for human occupation, rather than whatever was happening outside our improvised bunker. We sat in darkness except for my headlamp, LED technology providing illumination inadequate for psychological comfort but sufficient for immediate tactical needs. Tyler pressed against ammunition crates with movements that suggested regression to childhood behaviors. Adult consciousness partially shut down to protect psychological integrity from trauma beyond normal processing capabilities. Minutes stretched like hours in sensory deprivation that made time estimation impossible. Temporal displacement suggesting stress responses that affected neurological perception of duration. Silence thick enough to feel like physical pressure, absence of sound that implied presence of something large enough to absorb acoustic energy rather than reflect it. Then I cursed with vocabulary learned in military service, profanity emerging as emotional pressure valve when civilized responses proved inadequate for stress levels that exceeded normal human experience. The ventilation screws were turning with mechanical precision, metal threads backing out of holes with purposeful rotation that suggested tool use rather than natural manipulation. One screw dropped to concrete floor with metallic ping that echoed through enclosed space like gunshot. Acoustic properties suggesting structural modifications that changed resonance characteristics of the room. Tyler whimpered with sounds that belonged to prey animals rather than human beings. Vocalization patterns emerging from nervous systems programmed by evolution for survival situations beyond normal experience. I yanked him behind ammunition crates that provided concealment, if not protection. Ballistic materials designed to contain explosive force rather than stop penetration by claws, adapted for harder substances than military ordnance. Leveled the shotgun toward ventilation grate that would soon provide access for whatever had been stalking us through morning air. A narrow face pressed against mesh screening with features arranged according to anatomical principles I didn't recognize. facial structure suggesting evolutionary development under environmental pressures different from anything terrestrial organisms had experienced, skin texture like wet clay, organic surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, coloration adapted for camouflage in environments where normal pigmentation would prove disadvantageous, eyes reflected my headlamp beam like mercury plates, optical systems designed for light wavelengths beyond human visual spectrum but adapted to process full electromagnetic range with sensitivity that exceeded technological sensors, intelligence behind those metallic surfaces, consciousness operating according to logic systems I couldn't access but could recognize as systematic rather than instinctual, the lips peeled back with mechanical precision, revealing teeth shaped like pegs designed for scraping rather than tearing, dental structure adapted for food sources that required different processing methods than anything human digestive systems could handle. They vibrated against mesh screening with frequency that created harmonic resonance, acoustic effects designed to cause psychological distress in humans through subsonic manipulation. The chattering created patterns that hurt to hear directly, sound waves engineered to exploit weaknesses in human neurological processing, weapon systems biological rather than technological but superior to anything military science had developed for psychological warfare applications. I fired a slug through the ventilation opening with automatic response trained by years of combat experience, lead projectile designed to stop large game through kinetic energy transfer that should have disabled any terrestrial organism. The grate exploded outward in shower of metal fragments, structural materials failing under impact forces that exceeded design specifications. Plaster rained down like snow in aftermath of explosive decompression, building materials revealing structural weaknesses that normal use patterns wouldn't have exposed. The face vanished with speed that suggested movement capabilities beyond human visual tracking, disappearance so rapid it seemed like optical illusion rather than physical relocation. From overhead came skittering sounds like arthropod locomotion scaled up beyond reasonable size limits. Chitinous movement patterns suggesting exoskeletal anatomy adapted for rapid traverse through spaces too narrow for vertebrate movement. Then silence returned with weight that pressed against eardrums like atmospheric pressure change. I reloaded with movements made automatic by training, mechanical procedures that provided psychological comfort through familiarity when everything else exceeded normal experience parameters. Sweat blurred vision despite temperature conditions that should have promoted comfort rather than stress-induced perspiration, physiological responses suggesting fear levels that exceeded normal human coping mechanisms. Tyler clutched my sleeve with grip strength that left bruises, human contact providing reassurance that conscious minds craved when faced with isolation from everything recognizable as normal reality. He whispered through vocal cords damaged by screaming, voice carrying information that made situation assessment even worse than previous estimates. It laughs in Dad's voice, he told me through tears that carried salt content suggesting severe dehydration from stress responses that consumed water faster than normal metabolic processes required. Vocal mimicry capabilities that included emotional content rather than simple mechanical reproduction. Sophisticated analysis of human communication patterns that enabled psychological manipulation through familiar audio signatures. From the corridor, Dana's voice called with perfect intonation, rookie accent reproducing speech patterns I'd heard every day for months with accuracy that made recognition automatic despite logical impossibility. "Owen, door stuck, help me." The cadence matched her personality perfectly, sing-song drawl that characterized her enthusiasm for regulations and procedures. Yet Dana had never called me by first name during duty hours. Professional protocols that made informal address inconsistent with her training and personality. The voice was perfect, but the behavior was wrong, subtle inconsistency that revealed sophisticated mimicry operating without complete understanding of human social patterns. I kept the bolt drawn with hands trembling from adrenaline overload. Mechanical security that provided illusion of safety against threats that had already demonstrated ability to bypass physical barriers. The voice tried again, softer and more pleading. Emotional manipulation escalating when initial approach failed to achieve desired response. "Owen, please. I'm hurt." Perfect vocal reproduction combined with psychological pressure designed to exploit human protective instincts. Audio warfare that attacked empathy rather than physical systems. Social programming that made abandoning teammate feel like personal failure rather than tactical necessity. Then it used my voice, sobbing like child lost in darkness, recounting my own memories of fireline fatality that only existed in my head. Secret trauma from wildfire season 3 years ago, psychological scar tissue that no one else knew about because I'd never spoken those details to another human being. memory access that suggested capabilities beyond vocal mimicry, consciousness invasion that violated every assumption about mental privacy. The thing knew about Richard Matthews' burning in crown fire that jumped containment lines faster than evacuation procedures could move personnel to safety zones. It reproduced my internal monologue from that day, self-recrimination and survivor guilt that I'd never shared with counselors or colleagues. Emotional content that belonged inside my skull rather than external audio reproduction. I pressed palms over ears with pressure sufficient to block acoustic input, but the voice continued inside my head rather than through auditory channels. Direct neural access that bypassed sensory organs entirely. Consciousness contact that demonstrated capabilities belonging in science fiction rather than wilderness encounters. Tyler screamed for it to stop with volume that suggested vocal cord damage. Childhood trauma responses emerging as psychological defense mechanisms shut down under pressure that exceeded normal human coping strategies. His distress provided distraction that allowed me to focus on immediate tactical concerns rather than existential implications of mental invasion. Silence returned like curtain falling on theatrical performance. Acoustic absence that felt more threatening than sound because it suggested preparation for final act rather than conclusion of previous scene. Predator patience that implied confidence in eventual success. Temporal resources that exceeded human attention span capacity. A single thunk hit the hallway door with mechanical precision, measured impact that suggested structural analysis rather than random violence. Dust drifted from doorframe like snow announcing approaching storm. Particulate matter indicating stress distribution that revealed architectural weak points through systematic testing procedures. A second thunk struck higher on the frame, then a third lower, mapping exercise that demonstrated engineering knowledge rather than brute force approach. I pictured it calculating stress points with mathematical precision, deciding optimal application points for leverage systems that would bypass rather than overcome structural resistance. The methodical analysis continued with patience that belonged to geological processes rather than biological urgency, temporal scale that suggested immortal rather than mortal perspective on problem-solving approaches. Whatever conducted this examination operated according to time frames that made human haste irrelevant to eventual success calculations. I raised the shotgun with movements made clumsy by terror and prepared to make final stand in concrete box that provided concealment rather than protection. Ammunition supply adequate for extended engagement if targets presented vulnerability to kinetic energy transfer, but insufficient if conventional ballistics proved ineffective against anatomy adapted for different physical laws. The door exploded inward with violence that exceeded structural engineering predictions, wooden frame and steel reinforcement failing simultaneously under forces applied with surgical precision to critical failure points. Splinters whirled through air like shrapnel from improvised explosive device, debris patterns suggesting controlled demolition rather than random destruction. The thing unfolded through gap with movements that violated basic assumptions about solid matter behavior, not bursting but flowing like liquid, assuming shape of available space, taller than ceiling height but somehow fitting through opening too small for its dimensions, joints dislocating and relocating with mechanical precision that suggested modular anatomy rather than fixed skeletal structure, limbs bent at angles impossible for vertebrate joints, structural flexibility that allowed navigation through spaces designed for organisms with rigid internal frameworks, head glided sideways with serpentine fluidity while maintaining visual contact, optical tracking that never lost target acquisition despite anatomical contortions that should have disrupted sensory alignment. I fired center mass with lead slug designed to transfer maximum kinetic energy to target, ballistic impact that punched through torso with entry wound large enough to accommodate human fist. Gray paste sprayed against walls with viscosity suggesting biological fluids operating under different chemical principles than mammalian circulatory systems, but it kept advancing despite damage that should have caused immediate incapacitation. Structural integrity maintained through anatomical systems that didn't rely on single-point failure mechanisms. Pain responses either absent or irrelevant to motor function. Nervous system architecture that treated injury as data rather than debilitating trauma. Another slug to the knee joint with impact energy sufficient to shatter human bone structure through hydrostatic shock transmission. The leg folded in directions that violated normal articulation patterns yet continued to bear weight through mechanical systems that operated independently of traditional biomechanics. I backpedaled to give Tyler maneuvering room while maintaining firing solution, tactical movement designed for human opponents rather than targets that ignored conventional damage assessment protocols. My combat training assumed injury would degrade enemy capability through predictable physiological responses, assumptions that proved inadequate for anatomy that operated according to different engineering principles. The beast lunged toward Tyler with predatory focus that identified primary target through threat assessment calculations I couldn't understand. Priority selection that suggested specific mission parameters rather than opportunistic feeding behavior, strategic thinking that elevated this encounter beyond simple predator-prey interaction into military engagement requiring different tactical approaches, a jammed shotgun barrel under its jaw with leverage designed to prevent bite closure while directing muzzle blast through skull cavity for maximum neurological disruption. Fired upward with point-blank range that should have distributed lead shot through brain tissue with sufficient trauma to interrupt consciousness regardless of anatomical differences. Its head snapped backward with neck flexibility that absorbed impact energy through structural design rather than rigid resistance, jaw hanging by connective tissue that stretched rather than tearing under stress loads that would have separated human mandibles from facial structure. Anatomical engineering that provided damage absorption through elasticity rather than strength. A wet shriek erupted from vocal equipment designed for atmospheric conditions different from surface environment, sound production that generated more steam than acoustic energy through respiratory system adapted for gas exchange under pressure differentials that didn't exist at sea level. It swatted me with appendage that possessed joint configuration unknown to terrestrial anatomy. Impact force that buckled ribs through kinetic energy transfer sufficient to rupture internal organs. Breath vanished from lungs compressed beyond functional capacity. Respiratory system failure that should have caused immediate unconsciousness through oxygen deprivation. Tyler's eyes went wild with psychological pressure that pushed childhood coping mechanisms beyond breaking point. Survival instincts overriding rational thought as he grabbed my flare gun from emergency equipment shelf. Struck the igniter with movements made automatic by panic, phosphorus charge activating with chemical reaction that belonged in military ordnance rather than civilian signaling device. He fired into the monster's open torso cavity, with trajectory that delivered burning chemical payload directly into internal anatomy, incendiary material that adhered to organic tissue through molecular bonding designed for underwater applications. Red-white fire flared inside the creature like Chinese lantern illuminated from within, combustion process that revealed internal structure through translucent skin adaptation. Flame accomplished what bullets couldn't. Chemical energy attacking biological systems through thermal, rather than kinetic mechanisms. Flesh bubbled and split with cooking sounds that belonged in kitchen rather than combat situation. Protein denaturation occurring at molecular level through heat application that exceeded tissue tolerance parameters. The thing thrashed against walls with movements that spread burning material across file boxes and office furniture, creating secondary fires that filled enclosed space with smoke dense enough to obstruct vision beyond arm's length. Sprinkler systems failed to activate despite temperature sensors that should have triggered automatic suppression. Fire safety equipment rendered inoperative by earlier sabotage. Toxic fumes billowed from burning tissue that contained chemical compounds unknown to terrestrial biochemistry. Atmospheric contamination that made breathing dangerous through inhalation of organic compounds that belonged in industrial hazmat situations, rather than biological combustion. The water main had been severed earlier, infrastructure damage that prevented firefighting capability when it was most needed. Flames succeeded where conventional weapons had failed. Chemical reaction attacking cellular structure through processes that couldn't be adapted or circumvented through anatomical modification. Thermal energy transfer that worked regardless of evolutionary adaptations, universal physical law that applied to organic matter regardless of its planet of origin. Flesh continued burning with slow charcoal glow that emanated from internal structure, combustion process that suggested fuel composition different from normal fat and protein ratios found in terrestrial organisms. No recognizable odor emerged from the fire, chemical signatures that belonged to elements not found on standard periodic table. The creature staggered with movements that suggested system failure rather than pain response, mechanical breakdown occurring as thermal damage accumulated beyond repair capacity. It turned as if seeking escape route, survival programming finally overriding mission parameters when continued engagement threatened total system failure. It collapsed against metal shelving with impact force that toppled storage units, pinning the burning form under office supplies and emergency equipment that provided additional fuel for combustion process. The flares sputtered out after exhausting chemical payload, but internal fires continued with slow burn that suggested different chemical composition than normal biological tissue. I dragged Tyler through corridor filling with smoke that carried toxic compounds in concentrations dangerous to human respiratory systems, atmospheric contamination that required immediate evacuation from enclosed space, Office areas designed for human occupation proved inadequate for combat situations involving burning alien biology. Ventilation systems overwhelmed by chemical outputs beyond design parameters kicked the rear exit open with brute force sufficient to break security mechanisms. Emergency egress that provided access to fresh air that tasted like salvation after breathing atmosphere contaminated by burning monster. Morning sunshine felt warm and welcoming. Natural light that seemed inadequate just minutes earlier but now provided psychological comfort through familiar wavelength distribution. Park sirens wailed with mechanical authority that announced human response to emergency situation. Audio signals that meant backup was en route with equipment and personnel adequate for situations that exceeded individual capability. Someone outside the communication blackout had activated manual alarm systems. Human intervention that proved civilization still functioned beyond the immediate crisis zone. Volunteers and sheriff's deputies stormed the building with professional competence that restored faith in human institutions. Emergency responders who brought order to situations where chaos threatened to overwhelm rational response protocols. I collapsed on helipad gravel with injuries that required medical attention, physical trauma combining with psychological stress to exceed human endurance limits. Ribs stabbed with each breath. Bone fragments penetrating lung tissue through impact damage that medical training recognized as life-threatening without immediate surgical intervention. Ears rang with tinnitus that suggested acoustic trauma from explosive decompression. Auditory damage that might prove permanent depending on medical treatment quality. Dana was never found despite comprehensive search operations that covered 10 square miles using dogs trained for human scent detection and drones equipped with thermal imaging systems. Rangers combed wilderness areas with systematic thoroughness that should have located human remains regardless of concealment methods. Search protocols designed for terrain that couldn't hide evidence indefinitely. The thing's remains cooled into porous stone that resembled pumice in texture and density. Organic matter transforming into mineral composition through chemical processes that belonged in geology textbooks rather than biology studies. When touched, the material crumbled like volcanic glass, structural integrity maintained only while internal fires continued burning. I caught one deputy pocketing a fragment with movements that suggested collection rather than evidence preservation, behavioral pattern that raised questions about official investigation priorities versus personal curiosity about materials that exceeded normal classification systems. That deputy disappeared from duty roster within weeks, personnel changes that suggested administrative response to unauthorized sample collection. Tyler transferred schools and changed his legal name through court procedures that cost more than most families could afford. Identity modification that suggested federal assistance rather than personal resources. He won't answer my letters despite postal service confirmation of delivery. Communication avoidance that implied ongoing psychological treatment rather than simple desire for privacy. The park reopened after 6 months of investigation and infrastructure repair. New lighting systems and camera networks that provided surveillance coverage for areas previously monitored only by occasional patrol visits. Night permits ended permanently with official explanation citing budget constraints rather than safety concerns, administrative decision that avoided public discussion of actual reasons for policy changes. I still walk the shoreline some evenings when insomnia makes sleep impossible, fingering the warped radio Dana left behind with plastic deformation that suggested exposure to heat sources beyond normal fire temperatures. The device serves as tangible reminder of events that psychiatric evaluation classified as stress-induced hallucination despite physical evidence that contradicted medical opinion. The water sometimes returns faint red rings that drift across limestone pools before sinking as if pulled by currents that flow downward rather than horizontally. Displacement patterns that violate basic fluid dynamics through gravitational anomalies centered on specific geographic coordinates. Chemical analysis revealed iron oxide concentrations that exceeded natural occurrence levels, metallic contamination from sources that geological survey couldn't identify. No one visits the back areas of the springs anymore despite official statements that all park facilities remain safe for public use. Visitor avoidance that developed through informal communication networks rather than official warnings. The forest hasn't returned Dana's boot despite search efforts that included ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains under various environmental conditions. Sometimes, late at night when wind patterns carry sound across water with unusual clarity, I hear voices calling from depths that sonar equipment measured at 30 feet maximum. Acoustic phenomena that suggest audio transmission through limestone cavern systems that extend beyond mapped boundaries. underground networks that connect surface pools to subterranean chambers never included in park geological surveys. The calls use voices I recognize from my years of service, colleagues living and dead speaking words I never heard them say, conversations that suggest ongoing communication between surface world and whatever exists in spaces beneath bedrock. I don't respond to these audio contacts because training reminds me that vocal mimicry was the creature's primary hunting technique, but I listen because Dana's voice is sometimes among them, speaking my name with affection she never showed during our brief partnership, and Tyler's father asking if his son is safe, paternal concern that continues despite anatomical dissolution that should have ended conscious thought. I keep the reports locked in my desk drawer, incident documentation that psychiatric evaluation recommended against filing through official channels. The paperwork exists as evidence that events occurred regardless of medical opinion about their objective reality, written record that future investigators might need if similar encounters develop into pattern requiring institutional response. The Chickasaw National Recreation Area remains open to public access. Natural beauty that attracts families seeking outdoor recreation in an environment marketed as safe for children and elderly visitors. But the deeper wilderness areas stay empty except for official patrols that carry equipment designed for threats beyond normal wildlife management protocols. And sometimes, on clear mornings when atmospheric conditions allow sound transmission across unusual distances, park rangers report hearing laughter that echoes from limestone caverns that maps insist don't exist. Audio phenomena that suggest presence of consciousness in spaces where consciousness shouldn't be possible. Intelligence that finds human presumption entertaining enough to warrant ongoing observation. The springs continue flowing with mineral content that changes according to seasonal patterns that don't correspond to normal geological cycles. Chemical variations that suggest subsurface processes operating independently of documented aquifer systems. Water temperature remains constant despite atmospheric conditions that should affect thermal exchange. Environmental stability that implies controlled rather than natural regulation. I retired from Park Service 6 months after the incident, disability pension that reflected both physical injuries and psychological trauma that medical evaluation classified as severe but temporary. Official records indicate successful treatment through therapy protocols designed for post-traumatic stress disorder, documented recovery that satisfied administrative requirements for case closure. But I know what I saw in limestone darkness. And I know that something beneath Chickasaw National Recreation Area continues to wait with patience that measures time in geological rather than human scales. Intelligence that studied our technology and tactics, learning from encounter that provided valuable data about human capabilities and limitations. Tyler Harper isn't the only survivor, just the only one willing to speak about experiences that psychiatric evaluation insists never happened. Others have written letters describing similar encounters in wilderness areas across Oklahoma and neighboring states. Correspondence that suggests pattern rather than isolated incident. The letters describe creatures that match Tyler's testimony with accuracy that statistical analysis indicates represents shared experience rather than collaborative fiction. Details about anatomical structure and behavioral patterns that independent witnesses couldn't have coordinated without communication networks that don't exist between psychiatric patients in separate facilities. I collect these accounts in files that grow thicker each year. Documentation that might prove useful when official recognition finally acknowledges what wilderness rangers already know. That some areas remain wild because they're protected by intelligence that predates human expansion into territories where humans were never meant to establish permanent presence. The Chickasaw National Recreation Area represents compromise between human recreational needs and something older that tolerates limited intrusion as long as certain boundaries remain respected. Night permits ended because darkness belongs to residents who preceded human occupation by millions of years. And sometimes, when I wake screaming from dreams that replay events I'm not supposed to remember accurately, I wonder if Dana found something in those limestone depths that made her disappearance voluntary rather than violent. If she joined whatever exists beneath bedrock because surface existence seemed inadequate after experiencing consciousness that operates according to different physical laws. But Tyler's father wasn't given that choice. Anatomical evidence suggesting that some encounters end with consumption rather than recruitment. The thing maintains ecological balance through predation that includes human prey when population levels exceed sustainable limits, natural regulation that keeps recreational pressure within boundaries that deeper wilderness can tolerate. I keep watch because someone needs to document pattern development, to recognize when isolated incidents become systematic campaign, to warn authorities when defensive measures escalate beyond current containment protocols. The The thing learned from our encounter, adapting tactics that will prove more effective against future human incursions. And late at night, when limestone springs reflect starlight in patterns that hurt to observe directly, I listen to voices that speak from depths where human ears were never meant to function. Acoustic communication that carries promises of knowledge beyond human scientific understanding, consciousness expansion that comes with price measured in things more valuable than money. But I remember Tyler's father reduced to anatomical components. And I know that some knowledge costs more than human consciousness can afford to pay. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some territories better left unexplored. Some voices better left unanswered, regardless of what they promise to teach. The Chickasaw horror continues beneath limestone and spring water, patient as geological time, waiting for the next group of humans who venture beyond marked trails into wilderness that belongs to intelligence older than human civilization. And I'll be watching, documenting, remembering what happened when Dana Willis stepped into darkness that never gave her back. 2 hours after sunrise, I found the first boot. Laces shredded, foot still inside, and the forest went silent so fast it felt like my skull was underwater. The silence wasn't just absence of sound, it was presence of something else. Something watching, waiting, breathing just beyond the reach of my comprehension. Every instinct told me to turn back. Yet I advanced anyway, alone. My name is David Kersey, and this happened to me back in 2011 in Tongass National Forest, Alaska. The date was September 23rd, and I remember because it was the first day I'd noticed the birds had stopped singing entirely along the South Canoe Route. Not reduced their songs, not moved to different trees, stopped entirely as if something had taught them that sound meant death. I was covering the South Canoe Route because Jeff the rookie had called in sick, the third time that month. Jeff claimed stomach problems, but I'd seen his hands shake when he talked about his last patrol through that section. Rangers don't get stomach problems from walking familiar trails, but they do get them from walking trails where the shadows seem to move independent of the trees that cast them. The district radio tower was down for maintenance, its steel skeleton rising into the gray morning like a broken finger pointing accusations at the sky. So I carried the old-school brick handset with a 30-mile range in good terrain and maybe 3 in bad. The weight of it in my pack felt inadequate, like carrying a whisper into a thunderstorm. The boot lay on the moss like a warning in bold print, positioned too deliberately, too neatly for something that had been violently separated from its owner. The leather was still warm to the touch, and when I lifted it, dark fluid that wasn't quite blood dripped from the severed ankle, forming perfect circles on the moss below. Each drop sank into the earth with a soft hiss, as if the ground itself was hungry. No scavenger touches fresh flesh in the Tongass. The bears know better. The wolves know better. Everything with half a brain knows when something else has claimed territory. Something that doesn't follow the usual rules of predator and prey. The foot inside the boot was pale, almost translucent, with black veins visible beneath the skin like road maps to nowhere good. I stepped closer, crouched, and saw the cut was a single sweeping rip, almost surgical. No ragged bite marks, no gnawing, no tearing. Whatever had done this possessed precision that spoke of intelligence, of purpose, of tools that nature never intended any living thing to possess. The bone had been severed so cleanly it looked polished, and around the edges of the wound the flesh showed signs of exposure to something caustic. Burned, but not by fire. Base, this is Ranger Kersey, code yellow at mile marker 12. Possible fatality, I said into the handset, my voice echoing strangely in the unnatural quiet. The words seemed to fall dead from my lips, absorbed by the moss and mist before they could travel more than a few feet. Only white noise answered, a crackling static that formed patterns almost like whispers, almost like words spoken in a language that predated human speech. I adjusted the frequency, tried again, received only that same hungry static that seemed to pull at my thoughts, inviting me to listen deeper, to understand what it was really trying to say. I followed the drag trail, noting how it avoided direct contact with living trees, as if whatever had created it possessed an instinctive understanding of what should and shouldn't be touched. The trail wound past cedar trunks that bore strange marks about 7 feet up, parallel gouges that looked almost like claw marks, except they were too straight, too uniform, too deliberately spaced. The path led into muskeg that swallowed sound completely, transforming my footsteps into dull, muffled impressions that seemed to vanish before they fully formed. The air grew thicker here, carrying a metallic taste that coated my tongue and made my teeth ache. Each breath felt like drowning in reverse, filling my lungs with something that wasn't quite oxygen, wasn't quite water, but something in between that my body didn't know how to process. 30 yards in, I reached a second clue. A GoPro still blinking red in the mud, its small LED light pulsing like a digital heartbeat against the organic decay around it. The device was partially buried, as if it had been pressed into the earth by something heavy, something that had wanted to silence its electronic witness but lacked the knowledge to simply turn it off. I wiped it clean on my sleeve and clipped it to my belt, noting how the plastic housing showed signs of exposure to the same caustic substance that had marked the severed foot. The metal components were tarnished, corroded in patterns that resembled bite marks, as if something had tried to taste the technology and found it wanting. No time to watch the footage yet. No one bleeds slow from an amputation like that. Every second mattered, but every second also felt borrowed from something that would demand payment with interest. The forest around me seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart, as if it were reading my vitals, measuring my fear, calculating exactly how long I would last against whatever called this place home. Half a mile later, the prints changed, and this is where the real nightmare began. Classic Vibram sole impressions overlapped with deep gouges shaped like twin sickles. Not claw marks. These were too clean, too geometric, too purposeful. Even arcs, 4 inches apart, sinking a good 2 inches into earth that should have been too hard for anything biological to penetrate so deeply. The spacing suggested something heavy, balanced on only 2 points, moving with the calculated grace of a predator that had evolved far beyond the need for clumsy 4-legged locomotion. Between the human prints and the sickle marks, I found something else. Drops of that same dark fluid, but also patches of a translucent substance that caught the filtered sunlight like scattered jewels. When I knelt to examine it closer, the substance moved slightly, contracting and expanding with a rhythm that matched my own pulse. Touching it was out of the question. Every instinct I possessed screamed warnings about contact with whatever this thing was bleeding. I kept my Glock drawn, thumb safety off, but the weight of the weapon felt inadequate. Rangers train for bears, for wolves, for the occasional unhinged human who thinks federal land doesn't apply to them. We don't train for things that carve surgical incisions through ankle bone and leave behind substances that pulse with borrowed heartbeats. The trail led deeper into the muskeg, where the trees grew closer together and the canopy blocked out most of the morning light. Here, the silence took on weight, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat echoing from multiple directions, as if the forest itself had developed circulation and was pumping my blood through its twisted arteries. Voices drifted in, 2-day hikers from Juneau, a married couple I'd logged at the trailhead the previous morning. Maria and Glenn, late 50s, experienced hikers who'd been visiting the Tongass for over a decade. They knew the trails, knew the risks, knew how to avoid the dangerous areas that every local learns to respect, which made their voices, high with panic and edged with a terror that spoke of having seen something that couldn't be unseen, all the more disturbing. "Maria! Glenn!" I shouted, my voice disappearing into the muskeg as if it had never existed. The forest absorbed the sound so completely that I began to question whether I had actually spoken aloud or merely thought the words with desperate intensity. "Here! Help us!" Maria answered, her voice frantic, broken, carrying undertones that suggested she was fighting hysteria and losing. The direction was wrong, though. Her voice seemed to come from above, from the trees themselves, as if the forest was throwing her words back at me from impossible angles. They stood on a glacial rock spur above a sinkhole that I had never seen before, despite having patrolled this section dozens of times over the past 3 years. The sinkhole was perfectly circular, its edges cut with the same surgical precision that had marked the severed foot, as if something had carved it from the earth with tools designed for purposes that human minds couldn't comprehend. Glenn's left arm hung useless, but useless was inadequate to describe what I saw. The sleeve was gone, not torn but dissolved, leaving behind fabric edges that showed the same corrosion marks as the GoPro. The muscle looked peeled, layer by layer, with sections missing that revealed bone underneath. The pattern of damage was too organized to be random, too purposeful to be accidental. It looked like something had been conducting an experiment, testing the limits of human anatomy with scientific curiosity. Maria pressed a sweatshirt to the wound while trying to keep Glenn upright, but her hands shook with a tremor that suggested shock was settling in fast. Blood pooled at their feet, but it wasn't spreading naturally. It formed geometric patterns on the rock, as if something was directing its flow, using Glenn's life force to paint symbols that hurt to look at directly. I climbed toward them, noting how the rock face showed those same sickle marks. But here they formed a pattern, a deliberate arrangement that suggested communication rather than mere locomotion. Whatever had made these marks was intelligent enough to leave messages, and the content of those messages made my vision blur at the edges. "What did this?" I called out as I reached them, though part of me already knew the answer would be something my mind couldn't properly process. Glenn's lips shook as he tried to form words, his eyes reflecting a kind of knowledge that no human should possess. Big thing, he managed, each word costing him visible effort. It came out of the water. But not water. Something else. Something that looked like water but tasted like metal and moved like it was thinking. He meant the black water pool beneath us, fed by what I had always assumed was a hidden creek. Now, looking down at it, I could see that the liquid wasn't quite water. It moved with too much intention, forming patterns on its surface that resembled thoughts made visible. The substance seemed to react to our presence, forming small whirlpools that rotated in directions that defied the laws of physics. I checked the edge of the sinkhole, noting how thick reeds bent outward as if something huge had hauled itself up, then slid back down. The reeds weren't damaged though. They were altered, transformed into something that looked like reeds but felt wrong when I brushed against them. They were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as that translucent substance I'd found earlier. A briny odor, like low tide but wrong somehow, rolled out sharp against the cedar smell. The scent carried undertones of copper and something organic that had been dead for a very long time but hadn't been allowed to properly rot. It was the smell of preservation through unnatural means, of death that had been interrupted but not reversed. We needed evacuation, but the radio still spat static filled with what sounded like whispers in languages that predated human speech. The closest ranger station sat 2 hours away by boat, assuming the boat would start, assuming the water between here and there hadn't been claimed by whatever lived in the sinkhole. I tightened the tourniquet above Glenn's elbow, noting how his blood felt too warm, too thick, as if it had been infected with something that was changing its fundamental properties. The moment the tourniquet cut off circulation, Glenn's eyes rolled back, revealing whites that were no longer white, but showed dark veins spreading outward from the pupils like cracks in ice. I gave him my only morphine shot, watching as the drug entered his system and seemed to have no effect whatsoever. If anything, Glenn became more agitated, his remaining hand clawing at the rock face as if he could dig his way to safety through solid stone. Whatever was happening to him operated beyond the reach of conventional medicine. "You see anything, rise, fire," I told Maria, handing her the flare gun. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it, and when she gripped the weapon, I noticed her fingernails had begun to show the same dark veining that had appeared in Glenn's eyes. The contamination, whatever it was spreading through contact. They huddled together on the rock spur while I went to higher ground, searching for a signal that I suspected wouldn't come from any normal source. The ranger station seemed impossibly far away, not just in distance but in reality itself, as if this section of forest existed in a pocket dimension where the usual rules of communication and physics held no authority. 5 bars flickered on the handset's display, then died. But in that brief blink of connectivity, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The signal wasn't coming from the direction of the ranger station, it was coming from directly below us, from the sinkhole itself, as if something down there was broadcasting on the same frequency, mimicking our communication protocols with perfect technical precision. But in that moment of false connection, I remembered the GoPro clipped to my belt. I knelt behind a fallen cedar trunk, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching my every movement. My thumb found the play button, and the small screen flickered to life with footage that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The video showed the missing hiker jogging along the trail, camera bouncing with each step. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing the kind of expensive outdoor gear that marked him as someone from outside Alaska, someone who thought nature was something to be conquered rather than respected. He laughed at something off-screen, the sound carefree and innocent in a way that made what came next all the more horrifying. Then the frame lurched violently as water exploded from what should have been solid ground. But it wasn't water. The liquid that erupted from the earth moved with purpose, forming tentacle-like projections that defied gravity and surface tension. The camera spun wildly as the hiker was lifted into the air, and for just a moment, the lens captured something that my mind tried desperately to refuse. The creature that emerged from the false water was gray-green, its hide dotted with what I had mistaken for barnacles but now recognized as something far worse, sensory organs that tracked the camera's movement with predatory intelligence. Each barnacle contained what looked like an eye, not human, not animal, but something that had evolved in places where light had never touched. A single larger eye rolled toward the camera, round and glossy, with a pupil that wasn't just a slit but a geometric shape that hurt to look at directly. The intelligence behind that eye was vast, alien, and utterly malevolent. It wasn't just looking at the camera, it was looking through it, studying whoever would eventually watch this footage, learning about human technology and human fear with the patient curiosity of a scientist dissecting a particularly interesting specimen. The footage cut abruptly when a webbed hand slapped the lens, but not before I caught a glimpse of the hand itself. Not quite webbed in the traditional sense, but connected by membranes that pulsed with visible circulation. The digits ended in points that looked like surgical instruments, perfectly designed for the precise cuts I had seen throughout the forest. I felt my pulse bang in my ears as I processed what I had witnessed. This thing was amphibious, but not in any way that Earth's evolutionary history had prepared for. It was strong enough to tear limbs with surgical precision, possessed eyes built for absolute darkness, and demonstrated intelligence that suggested it was studying us as much as hunting us. The salt smell suddenly made horrible sense. This creature moved between the inland waterways and the sea, but not through natural channels. It was using the Tongass's complex water system as a highway, and every isolated pool, every hidden creek, every mysterious sinkhole was potentially a doorway to its hunting ground. A shout crashed through my thoughts like breaking glass. Maria's voice, no longer quite human, stretched thin with a terror that spoke of having witnessed something that shouldn't exist in any rational universe. I bolted back toward the sinkhole, noting how the forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing where none had existed moments before, trees rearranging themselves to confuse my sense of direction. The very landscape was working against me, or perhaps working for something else, something that understood the art of herding prey toward a predetermined destination. Maria stood frozen on the rock spur, the flare gun smoking in her hand. An orange streak hissed through the air above us, disappearing into the canopy where it illuminated the trees in a brief, hellish glow that revealed shapes moving between the branches. Shapes that vanished the moment the light faded. Glenn was gone, dragged away so quietly that even the tourniquet had been left behind, snapped cleanly in half rather than untied or torn. Only a few drops of blood marked where he had been, and those drops moved on the rock surface with deliberate intent, flowing upward in defiance of gravity toward the edge of the sinkhole. Maria's mouth moved soundlessly, forming words that her voice couldn't support. Finally, she managed a whisper. It took him, but he smiled. David, why did he smile like that? Why did he look happy when it pulled him down? I scanned the area frantically, my Glock feeling as useful as a pointed stick against what we were facing. The reed beds on the far side of the sinkhole rustled with movement that was too large, too coordinated to be wind. Through the vegetation, I caught glimpses of something that shouldn't exist, moving with purposeful grace. The shape lumbered through the reeds with shoulders higher than a grizzly's, but the proportions were all wrong. The skin was slick and reflective, changing color to match its surroundings but never quite getting the camouflage perfect. The head was narrow like a spear tip, designed for underwater navigation, but the jaw hinged in ways that violated everything I knew about vertebrate anatomy, stretching wide not just vertically but laterally, as if it could dislocate its entire skull to accommodate prey of any size. It dragged Glenn by the legs, and this is the detail that will never leave me. Glenn wasn't struggling. He moved with the boneless compliance of someone who had been fundamentally changed, transformed from human to something else. Something that understood its new purpose in whatever ecosystem this creature had created in the depths of the Tongass. The dragging was silent, except for Glenn's boot scraping against stone, a sound that echoed from too many directions, as if the forest itself was broadcasting the noise to disorient any potential rescuers. I fired, my first round striking the creature's shoulder with a wet impact that sprayed ichor in geometric patterns. The head jerked toward me, those multiple sensory organs focusing on my position with laser precision, but the creature didn't drop its prey. Instead, it paused, tilting its head as if analyzing the ballistic properties of my weapon, calculating its threat level with the dispassionate curiosity of a researcher encountering a new variable in an ongoing experiment. I fired again, this time aiming for center mass. The bullet struck true, punching through something that might have been a chest cavity, but instead of blood, a spray of that translucent substance erupted from the wound. Where the liquid touched the reeds, they began to transform, their cellular structure rewriting itself in real time. The creature didn't fall. It didn't even seem particularly injured. Instead, it turned its attention fully to me, those alien eyes studying my position, my weapon, my probable escape routes with the methodical precision of something that had been hunting intelligent prey for far longer than humans had existed. Then it vanished into the reeds with Glenn in tow, moving with impossible speed and silence. A muffled splash followed from somewhere that shouldn't have contained enough water for something that large to submerge completely. We ran. Maria stumbled, shock eating her balance, but adrenaline and the sound of something massive moving through the forest parallel to our position kept her upright. The path forked ahead, offering two choices that both felt like traps designed by something that understood human psychology better than we understood ourselves. I chose the service road that led to the derelict cannery by Portage Inlet, making a decision based on decades of experience that suddenly felt inadequate in the face of what we were fleeing. The building still stored diesel in rusted tanks, and diesel meant signal fires, meant visibility, meant the possibility of attracting rescue before whatever was hunting us decided to stop playing with its prey. "Why there?" Maria wheezed, her voice carrying undertones of hysteria that I recognized as the sound of a mind trying to protect itself from information it couldn't process. "Concrete walls," I said, though the truth was more complex and more desperate. "It can't burrow through concrete." At least that's what I told her, what I told myself, clinging to assumptions about physics that might not apply to something that had evolved in the deep places where light and logic held no meaning. What I didn't say was that I needed a kill box, a controlled environment where I could observe this thing's behavior without worrying about ambush from multiple directions. The cannery's industrial architecture would force the creature to approach from predictable angles, assuming it was limited by the same spatial constraints that governed every other living thing on Earth. The wind shifted, bringing the tide stench again, but stronger now, mixed with overtones of something like ammonia and the sweet corruption of meat that had been exposed to digestive enzymes. The smell told a story. This creature didn't just kill its prey. It processed them, broke them down chemically, transformed them into something useful for purposes that human minds couldn't comprehend. The odor was traveling faster than us, moving through the forest with supernatural efficiency as if the creature could project its presence through scent alone. More disturbing was the realization that it was moving parallel to our route inside the alder thicket, pacing our retreat with the patient persistence of something that knew exactly where we were going and was content to let us lead the way. Branches broke softly in the thicket, not the violent snapping of something forcing its way through vegetation, but the controlled manipulation of obstacles by something that understood stealth better than any natural predator. The sounds were spaced to match our jogging pace, a deliberate psychological tactic designed to let us know we were being herded. I fired blind into the brush, 3 rounds spaced to cover maximum area. The muzzle flashes illuminated brief glimpses of movement between the trees, something pale and segmented flowing through the undergrowth with liquid grace. The shots had no visible effect except to pause the pursuit momentarily, as if the creature was analyzing the ballistic data and adjusting its approach accordingly. The noise stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the stalking sounds. In the absence of movement, I could hear other things. A wet sliding sound, like something massive breathing through liquid-filled lungs. A soft clicking that might have been communication with others of its kind, and underneath it all, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. We kept moving, following the service road through forest that grew increasingly unnatural the closer we got to the cannery. The trees here showed signs of long-term exposure to whatever the creature secreted, bark that had been chemically altered to serve as some kind of marking system, branches that grew in geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. The cannery building emerged from the mist like a concrete monument to industrial decay, its walls stained with decades of weather and neglect. But there were newer stains too, organic patterns that suggested the building had been used for purposes other than fish processing. The loading dock showed those same sickle marks I had seen throughout the forest, but here they formed complex spirals that led from the water's edge to a service entrance that hung open like a hungry mouth. The steel door should have been chained shut, should have been secured against trespassers, but the heavy chains lay on the ground in pieces that had been cut with the same surgical precision that had marked everything else. The padlock was intact, untouched, as if whatever had gained entry possessed the intelligence to manipulate the locking mechanism rather than simply destroying it. I shot the padlock anyway, the metallic clang echoing through the building's interior and bouncing back to us distorted by acoustics that shouldn't exist in a simple industrial space. The sound carried undertones of other voices, other screams, as if the concrete walls had absorbed decades of suffering and were now releasing it in harmonic frequencies that bypassed conscious hearing and went straight to the primitive terror centers of the brain. Inside, sunlight cut through roof holes in geometric patterns that cast shadows on the floor in configurations that resembled the markings I had seen throughout the forest. Dust swirled in the light beams with too much purpose, forming spirals and helixes that suggested the air itself had been contaminated by whatever presence had claimed this space. The industrial equipment remained largely intact, Massive steel processing machines that showed signs of recent use despite the cannery's decades-long abandonment. Cones of daylight marked piles of old fishing nets, wooden crates, and oil drums, but also revealed newer additions to the inventory. Organic structures that might have been cocoons or egg cases, translucent sacs that pulsed with the same rhythm I had observed in the creature's bodily fluids. I led Maria to a workstation table in the center of the space, positioning her where she could see all the entrances while remaining hidden from direct line of sight from the doorways. I loaded her pockets with flare cartridges, noting how the pyrotechnic devices felt warmer than they should, as if they were reacting to some ambient energy source within the building. "If it gets through me, light everything," I instructed, meaning not just the flares but the building itself. The diesel storage tanks would turn the entire structure into an inferno that might be visible from the ranger station, might attract the kind of attention that could save us or at least ensure our deaths served some useful purpose. Footsteps echoed from the corridor, but the acoustics were wrong, suggesting movement through a space larger than the building's original blueprints should have accommodated. The steps were too slow, too deliberate, placed with the careful precision of something that was analyzing the structural integrity of the floor before committing its full weight to each movement. My shotgun lay on a weapon rack against the far wall, an old Remington that the previous site manager had left behind, along with a selection of ammunition that included both standard buckshot and specialized rounds designed for dealing with problem wildlife. I sprinted across the open floor, noting how my footsteps echoed back from directions that shouldn't contain reflective surfaces. I grabbed the shotgun and racked a slug shell, the mechanical action providing a moment of comfort in its familiar precision. The weapon felt solid, reliable, designed for purposes I understood. But as I turned back toward the entrance, I realized that understanding and preparation were inadequate concepts for what was about to enter our killing ground. It entered through the main doorway with movements that challenged every assumption I held about vertebrate locomotion. 7 feet tall, maybe more, but hunched to clear the doorframe in a gesture that spoke of intelligence and spatial awareness rather than mere instinct. The posture was temporary, a concession to human architecture that it could abandon the moment circumstances required. The skin was gray-green but not uniformly colored. It shifted and flowed like liquid mercury, adjusting its reflectivity and hue to match the industrial surroundings with chameleon-like precision. Patches of white structures along the spine that I had mistaken for barnacles were revealed in the better light to be something far more disturbing: sensory organs that tracked our movements independently of the creature's head, creating a panoramic awareness that eliminated blind spots entirely. Long arms ended not in hands but in dual appendages that combined the worst aspects of surgical instruments and organic weapons. 2 hook digits emerged from each limb, framed by thick webbing that glistened with secreted lubricants designed for underwater manipulation. The hooks weren't claws in any traditional sense, they were tools, precision instruments that could function as gripping appendages, cutting implements, or injection devices depending on the tactical requirements of the moment. No eyes were visible in its head, but this was the most terrifying detail of all. The ocular organs were protected by a translucent membrane that rendered them nearly invisible while maintaining full visual capability. The creature was studying us with senses that operated across spectrums of light and energy that human perception couldn't access, analyzing our heat signatures, our chemical emissions, our electromagnetic fields with scientific thoroughness. But it could smell us. Nostrils flared along what might have been a nasal cavity, but the breathing apparatus was distributed across multiple openings that dilated and contracted in complex patterns. It was tasting the air, analyzing our fear pheromones, measuring our adrenaline levels, calculating our remaining fight-or-flight reserves with the precision of a predator that had learned to read its prey like biological instruments. I fired point blank, the slug punching through what served as the creature's chest cavity and exiting through the back wall in a spray of ichor and fragments of metal from the diesel tank it ruptured. The impact was devastating by any normal standard, leaving a hole large enough to see through. Yet the creature's reaction suggested annoyance rather than trauma. The wound hissed like steam escaping from a ruptured pressure vessel, but instead of blood, only that thin black fluid emerged, pooling on the concrete floor in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The liquid seemed to move with purpose, forming geometric configurations that resembled circuit diagrams or maybe organic neural networks. A mist of diesel fuel from the ruptured line behind the creature caught the afternoon light streaming through the roof holes, creating a rainbow effect that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The fuel vapor mixed with the creature's secretions, producing chemical reactions that filled the air with corrosive fumes that burned my lungs and made my eyes water. The creature straightened from the impact's force, joints articulating in ways that violated basic anatomy, It turned its attention to me with the slow deliberation of something that was recalculating its assessment of human weaponry, adjusting its tactical approach based on new data about our technological capabilities. Another slug. I aimed for the head, the shell striking what I hoped was a vital region and snapping the creature's skull back with violent force. The membrane protecting its eyes rippled like water, briefly revealing the alien intelligence beneath, but the head remained attached, merely canted at an angle that would have been fatal to any terrestrial creature. No blood poured from either wound, only that thin black fluid that seemed to serve multiple functions. Lubricant, coolant, and communication medium all combined into a single biological system that operated beyond the boundaries of Earth-based biochemistry. It stepped toward me with movements that defied physics, covering distance with strides that should have been impossible given its apparent size and mass. The creature moved like something that had evolved in an environment where gravity and momentum followed different rules, each step calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum energy expenditure. One stride covered the distance between us faster than I could process, bringing me within reach of those surgical appendages that gleamed with secreted toxins designed for purposes I didn't want to contemplate. I backed until a crate stopped my retreat, my hands slapping frantically at the weapon rack for additional shells that might buy me precious seconds of continued existence. Empty. The rack was empty, cleaned out by scavengers or maybe removed deliberately by someone who had encountered this thing before and understood the futility of conventional weapons. I drew the Glock, fired 6 rounds at what I hoped were knee joints, aiming for structural damage rather than lethality. The shots slowed it marginally, not through injury but through the creature's apparent fascination with the ballistic impacts. It studied each wound with scientific curiosity, as if collecting data about human weapons that it could relay to others of its kind. The bullets passed through its body, leaving holes that sealed themselves with that translucent membrane, self-healing wounds that trapped the projectiles inside its body cavity where they could be analyzed at leisure. Webbed feet slipped in the diesel film spreading across the concrete floor, providing the first tactical advantage I had observed. The creature's locomotion system, perfectly adapted for underwater environments, was compromised by the industrial lubricants that coated every surface. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had found something resembling an exploitable weakness. Maria screamed, duck, and loosed a flare with perfect timing and accuracy born of desperation and survival instinct. The red star traced across the room in a brilliant arc, kissing the leaking fuel behind the creature and igniting a conflagration that transformed the entire back wall into a curtain of fire. Heat punched my face with physical force, superheated air that carried particles of burning diesel and vaporized alien biochemistry that seared my lungs and made my skin feel like it was shrinking. The creature howled, but the sound wasn't pain, it was communication, a high metallic whistle that carried complex information about our position, our weapons, our probable tactics. The fire rolled up the wall and raced along the puddle of diesel under the creature's feet, creating a pool of flame that should have been lethal to anything biological. But instead of dying, the creature staggered, its secretions reacting with the burning fuel to produce chemical reactions that filled the air with toxic clouds that made breathing an exercise in controlled poisoning. Arms pinwheeled as the creature lost balance on the slick surface, skin blistering and changing color, but not burning in any way that suggested actual damage. The fire was an inconvenience, a complication that required adaptation rather than retreat. Even as flames consumed the back wall, the creature was learning, studying the combustion process, incorporating the data into its understanding of human defensive capabilities. The flames drove it backward into a stack of crates that collapsed under its weight, pinning it for perhaps 3 seconds against the far wall. Those 3 seconds were the margin between life and death, the narrow window that allowed us to escape rather than join Glenn in whatever fate the creature had planned for its human specimens. That brief entrapment saved us, but it also revealed something terrifying about the creature's intelligence. As the crates fell, I saw it position itself deliberately, using the collapse to shield vital organs while allowing non-essential body parts to absorb the impact. It was thinking, planning, using its apparent vulnerability as camouflage for its true capabilities. I grabbed Maria, hauled her through a side door that led to the loading dock, noting how the creature's howls were being answered by similar sounds from the forest around us. We weren't dealing with a single entity, this was a coordinated operation, a hunting party that had been studying human behavior and was now implementing strategies based on that research. We pounded down the dock toward the waterfront, boots hammering against weathered planks that showed the same sickle marks I had seen throughout the forest. The wooden structure groaned under our weight, but the sounds it made were wrong, too organic, too much like something breathing heavily through damaged lungs. Each plank we crossed seemed to pulse beneath our feet, as if the entire dock had been transformed into part of some vast organism that extended far beyond what we could see. Behind us, glass shattered in sequence, each window blowing outward with the systematic precision of controlled demolitions. Smoke billowed from the cannery in a column of oily black that rose into the spruce canopy like a funeral pyre for sanity itself. The smoke moved against the wind, forming patterns in the sky that resembled the geometric configurations I had seen in the creature's secretions, as if even the combustion products were being directed by an intelligence that understood atmospheric manipulation. The inferno grew louder than the creature's shrieks, but the sounds blended in harmonics that created new frequencies, new meanings that bypassed human language and communicated directly with the fear centers of the brain. The fire wasn't just consuming the building. It was being consumed by something else, transformed into a beacon that would be visible for miles, advertising our position to whatever else might be hunting in the Tongass. We kept running until the dock planks ended in salt water that reflected the burning cannery like a mirror made of liquid obsidian. The water was wrong though. Too still, too thick, moving with currents that formed spirals and helixes, similar to the patterns I had observed in the creature's body fluids. The inlet had been contaminated, transformed into an extension of whatever ecosystem these things had created in the deep places. A skiff bobbed against the dock's end, half sunken but still functional, its aluminum hull showing corrosion patterns that told a story of prolonged exposure to substances that shouldn't exist in Earth's oceans. Splintered oars lay inside the boat, their wood grain showing signs of deliberate modification, carved with symbols that hurt to examine directly. I shoved the boat free from its moorings, noting how the water displaced around it moved with too much intention, as if the inlet itself was a living thing that was deciding whether to allow our escape. The liquid that splashed onto the dock hissed where it made contact with the wood, eating through the planks with controlled chemical precision. We paddled with the damaged oars, each stroke taking us further from shore but not necessarily closer to safety. The water around us was alive with movement that stayed just below the surface, shapes that kept pace with our progress, studying our escape route with patient intelligence. Occasionally something would breach near the boat, revealing glimpses of anatomy that belonged to no known marine species. From this distance on the water, I could see the cannery's roof give way in a spectacular fireball that illuminated the entire forest in hellish orange light. But the explosion revealed more than just industrial destruction. It showed movement in the trees, coordinated activity that suggested whatever we had encountered was part of a larger network, a community of entities that had been using the Tongass as their hunting ground for far longer than human records indicated. The dock ignited behind us, planks catching fire in sequence like dominoes falling in slow motion, but the flames burned wrong colors, blues and greens that spoke of chemical reactions involving elements that weren't on the periodic table. The burning structure collapsed into the inlet with impacts that sent waves rolling toward us, waves that carried more than just displaced water. Something large, maybe pieces of the creature we had fought, slammed into the inlet with distant smacks that echoed from multiple directions. But the impacts were too organized, too rhythmic to be random debris. Whatever was entering the water was doing so deliberately, coordinating with others of its kind to establish a perimeter around our escape route. The tide pulled the burning debris away from shore like lanterns floating on a river of liquid darkness. Each piece of wreckage moved with purpose, forming patterns on the water's surface that resembled a communication network, a system for relaying information across vast distances using methods that transcended human understanding of marine biology. Maria sat in the stern, shaking uncontrollably, the flare gun loose in her grip like a talisman that had lost its protective power. Her eyes reflected the burning cannery, but also something else, a depth of knowledge that no human should possess, as if prolonged exposure to the creature had infected her with understanding that her mind wasn't equipped to process. "Glenn?" she asked, the single word carrying weight that encompassed not just her husband's fate, but the implications for every person who had ever disappeared in the Tongass without explanation. Her voice had changed, carrying undertones that reminded me of the creature's whistling communication, as if the infection was spreading through auditory contact. I couldn't answer because the truth was too large, too terrible to speak aloud. Glenn hadn't been killed. He had been recruited, transformed, inducted into whatever ecosystem these entities had established in the deep places. The smile Maria had seen as he was dragged away wasn't madness but enlightenment, the expression of someone who had finally understood his purpose in a cosmic order that operated beyond human morality. The water around our boat began to emit a soft phosphorescence, bacteria or chemical reactions creating light that moved in patterns too organized to be natural. The luminescence tracked our movement, mapping our position for things that hunted by senses humans couldn't comprehend. Every stroke of the oars left a trail of glowing disturbance that marked our passage like breadcrumbs leading predators directly to us. We beached at a ranger outpost jetty 3 hours later, though time had become fluid, elastic, measured by heartbeats rather than clock ticks. The small dock showed signs of recent use but not by Park Service personnel. Sickle marks in the wood, deposits of that translucent substance, and most disturbing of all, personal effects arranged in geometric patterns that suggested ritual significance. My radio crackled to life for the first time since morning, but the voice that emerged from the static wasn't human. It spoke in frequencies that bypassed conscious hearing, delivering information directly to the primitive terror centers of the brain. The message was clear despite its alien nature. We had been allowed to escape, permitted to survive for purposes that served the entity's long-term objectives. Rescue teams flew in by evening, Coast Guard helicopters that approached from directions suggesting their pilots had been subtly guided to avoid certain areas of the forest. The search crews combed the shoreline with equipment that should have detected any biological remains, but they found nothing larger than a charred fragment that the lab would later identify as unknown marine vertebrate with cellular structures inconsistent with terrestrial evolutionary patterns. The investigation was thorough, professional, conducted by people who had seen enough wilderness tragedies to approach the evidence with appropriate skepticism, but their instruments couldn't measure the wrongness that permeated the entire area, the subtle alteration of reality that marked territory claimed by something that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional biology. DNA analysis of the fragments revealed genetic sequences that didn't match anything in the database, genetic patterns that suggested evolution in environments where the fundamental constants of physics operated differently. The lab techs who processed the samples reported equipment malfunctions, contamination that spread through their instruments like digital cancer, and dreams filled with geometric shapes that hurt to remember upon waking. The case file closed with probable rogue bear incident, a designation that made the old rangers laugh until they heard the audio recording recovered from my equipment. The creature's scream, captured on digital media, ended those laughs abruptly. Veteran Park Service personnel who had dealt with every form of wildlife Alaska could produce listened to the recording once and refused to discuss it afterward. They sealed the file, classified it under procedures that technically didn't exist for Park Service incidents. The recording was transferred to facilities that operate beyond public oversight, studied by specialists who understand that the natural world contains pockets of unnatural horror that must be contained rather than explained. A month later, I quit the Park Service, submitting resignation paperwork that cited personal reasons rather than the truth. That prolonged exposure to whatever inhabited the deep places of the Tongass had begun to change me in ways that made normal human society increasingly difficult to navigate. My dreams were filled with geometric patterns that resembled circuit diagrams for biological systems that shouldn't exist. Maria moved back to Juneau, but her letters revealed a similar infection of understanding. She wrote about tasting metal in the rain, about hearing whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech, about seeing movement in bodies of water that should have been empty. The contamination was spreading through us like a slow virus, rewriting our perception of reality one synapse at a time. We email on anniversaries of the incident, keeping the messages short, clinical, focused on mundane details that don't trigger the deeper memories that wait just below conscious awareness. Neither of us signs off with goodbye because goodbye implies an ending, and what happened in the Tongass was a beginning, an initiation into knowledge that continues to unfold with each passing year. We just stop typing when the weight of unspoken understanding becomes too heavy to bear. When the words we're not writing begin to arrange themselves into patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. The silence between our messages carries more meaning than any language humans have developed, communicating truths that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the infected portions of our consciousness. I still do day hikes, but never near bodies of water that don't connect to larger systems, never in areas where the tree growth shows signs of geometric organization, never when the wind carries scents that remind me of low tide mixed with surgical antiseptic. The parameters of safe wilderness have been permanently redefined by knowledge that I wish I could unknow. When I smell that particular combination of brine and metal in the middle of the forest, I keep moving inland, away from water sources, away from the interconnected network of streams and pools that serve as highways for things that have claimed the deep places as their hunting ground. But moving inland isn't always enough. The contamination spreads through groundwater, through root systems, through the interconnected web of life that makes true isolation impossible. Last week, my old Park Service handset crackled to life despite having been dead for years, its battery long since corroded beyond functionality. The sound emerged from speakers that shouldn't have been capable of producing audio. A single burst of static followed by that familiar whistle, the creature's communication frequency, still broadcasting, still coordinating with others of its kind, but the whistle had changed, evolved, incorporated new elements that suggested learning, adaptation, improvement. The intelligence behind the sound had been studying human technology, human behavior, human weaknesses, preparing for something larger than isolated hunting incidents in remote wilderness areas. I dropped the radio down a granite fissure and walked away without looking back. But the whistle followed me, carried on wind currents that moved against meteorological logic. The sound embedded itself in my auditory memory, where it continues to play on frequencies just below conscious hearing. A constant reminder that the contamination isn't limited to those who directly encountered the entities. The infection spreads through exposure to the sound itself, through proximity to contaminated water sources, through consumption of fish that have swum in altered ecosystems. What began as an isolated incident in the Tongass has become a slow-motion apocalypse, a transformation of Earth's biosphere that operates below the threshold of human awareness. And sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, when the world is quiet enough to hear sounds that shouldn't exist, I catch fragments of that whistle carried on the wind from directions that don't contain water sources. The entities are expanding their territory, moving inland through underground networks that connect to aquifers, to municipal water systems, to the biological infrastructure that makes human civilization possible. The geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly are appearing in crop circles, in aerial photographs of urban development, in the architectural plans for new construction projects designed by engineers who wake up screaming from dreams they can't remember. The contamination has moved beyond the wilderness, beyond the boundaries that once contained it, spreading through the network of human activity like a virus transmitted through infrastructure itself. I know what's coming, can feel it building in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between raindrops, in the silence that follows thunder. The entities in the deep places have finished their study of human civilization, have completed their analysis of our strengths and weaknesses, and are preparing to implement whatever plan they have been developing in the darkness beneath the world's water sources. But knowing doesn't make escape possible. The contamination has already spread too far, infected too many systems, altered too much of the biological and technological infrastructure that supports human life. We are all swimming in waters that have been claimed by something that understands predation on a scale that encompasses entire species, entire planets, entire realities. The whistle continues, day and night, carried on frequencies that bypass conscious hearing and speak directly to the portions of human consciousness that remember when our ancestors lived in caves and feared the darkness beyond the firelight. But this darkness doesn't wait beyond the light. It has learned to live within it, to use our own illumination against us, to transform our technological achievements into tools for purposes we cannot comprehend. And in the deep places of the world, where light has never touched and logic holds no authority, other entities wait for the signal to begin their own emergence, their own contribution to whatever transformation the Tongass creatures have initiated. The waters are rising, not with flood but with life forms that have evolved beyond the boundaries of terrestrial biology, and soon the whistle will become a symphony that announces the end of one world and the beginning of another. The transformation has already begun. It began the moment I found that first boot on the moss, the moment I followed the trail into the muskeg, the moment I looked into eyes that had evolved in places where different laws of physics apply. We are all contaminated now, all participants in an experiment that will determine whether humanity can adapt to coexistence with intelligences that regard us as we regard the bacteria in a petri dish. The whistle grows stronger every day, clearer, more insistent, calling to others of its kind across vast distances, coordinating a network of entities that spans continents, that operates through water systems and root networks and the electromagnetic fields generated by modern technology. The invasion isn't coming, it's already here, established, integrated into the infrastructure of human civilization, and somewhere in the deep places of the Tongass, Glenn continues his work, transformed into something that serves purposes beyond human understanding, wearing a smile that speaks of enlightenment rather than madness, contributing to a project that will reshape the world according to geometries that hurt human minds to contemplate. The nightmare is real, and it's just beginning. The morning mist clung to the Ouachita National Forest like the breath of something long dead, rising from the valleys in ghostly tendrils that seemed to whisper warnings only the trees could understand. My name is Marcus Ellery, and what happened to me in these woods in 2017 changed everything I thought I knew about the natural order of things. We'd planned it as a simple day loop, just my sister Claire, her husband Rob, their 14-year-old boy Toby, and me. A family outing, nothing more dangerous than fishing the Little Missouri River and maybe grilling some steaks over oak coals back at the campground. The kind of wholesome Arkansas tradition our grandfather would have approved of, back when these forests were still considered safe after dark. I brought my old Marlin lever gun more out of habit than necessity. Black bears kept their distance if you kept yours, and the occasional wild boar was easily discouraged by a warning shot. Claire laughed when she saw me loading the rifle into the truck, but I noticed she slipped her Glock from the glove compartment into her pack anyway. Some instincts run deeper than conscious thought. The Albert Pike trailhead was deserted at dawn, which should have been our first warning. Even on weekdays, you'd usually see a few early hikers or fishermen gearing up for the day, but the parking area stretched empty except for our truck, the gravel lot somehow feeling too exposed under the pale morning sky. Toby emerged from the back seat already energized, his red hoodie bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. At 14, he possessed that fearless curiosity that made adults nervous, always eager to explore every side trail and investigate every unusual sound. Rob had been the same way at that age, according to Claire, always pushing boundaries, always certain that adventure lay just around the next bend. The trail started innocuously enough, winding through stands of loblolly pine and oak, their canopy filtering the morning light into shifting patterns on the forest floor. The familiar sounds of a healthy woodland surrounded us, the distant drum of a woodpecker, the rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth, the occasional call of a blue jay warning others of our presence. But as we descended toward the Little Missouri River, something began to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The bird calls seemed forced, almost mechanical, as if the creatures were going through the motions of normalcy while something else entirely commanded their attention. The very air felt heavier, thick with a humidity that had nothing to do with the weather. It was Rob who first noticed the absolute silence that had fallen over the woods. One moment we were surrounded by the typical chatter and movement of forest life. The next we walked through a cathedral of unnatural quiet. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by some invisible presence that watched from between the trees. "Must be a storm coming," Claire said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested she didn't believe her own explanation. Weather didn't make forests go completely silent. Predators did. The first tangible sign of wrongness appeared just before we reached the plunge pool below Little Missouri Falls. There, crossing the well-worn trail like a challenge, stretched a row of prints that made us all stop dead in our tracks. These weren't bear paws or cougar tracks. Each print measured twice the span of my hand, with pads pressed so deep into the soft earth they looked like heel marks. But it was the claws that made my blood run cold. 5 distinct furrows extending from each pad, raking the soil like the marks of some prehistoric killing machine. "Mountain lion," Rob said, but uncertainty clouded his voice. The pad shape was all wrong for any cat, too broad and humanoid. The gait was wrong too. Whatever had made these tracks walked upright, placing one foot directly in front of the other with the mechanical precision of something that had learned to walk like a man but retained the stride of a much larger creature. Toby pulled out his phone to photograph the tracks, excited by this evidence of something extraordinary in the mundane world of a family hiking trip. But as he raised the device, the screen flickered and died. No signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the forest, but the phone had been fully charged when we started. Now it was completely dead, as if something had drained every electron from its battery. One by one, we checked our phones. All dead. All completely, inexplicably drained of power despite having full charges less than an hour ago. The tracks crossed the trail and vanished into the river rock on the other side, as if whatever made them had simply walked across the water without leaving any trace on the submerged stones. We stood there in that unnatural silence, staring at evidence of something that shouldn't exist, while the forest around us held its breath. "We should go back," Claire said quietly, her maternal instincts finally overriding her embarrassment at seeming paranoid. But Rob was already following the trail toward the river, his masculine pride refusing to be intimidated by some unusual animal tracks. "Come on," he called back to us. "It's probably just a really big black bear. They can leave weird tracks in soft soil." But I was studying those prints more carefully, and what I saw made my skin crawl. The spacing was too regular, too purposeful. This wasn't an animal wandering through its territory in search of food or water. This was something moving with intent, following a specific route for a specific purpose, and the route it was following led directly to where we were headed. As we continued toward the river, the silence deepened until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. Even Toby had stopped his usual chatter, unconsciously picking up on the wrongness that permeated these woods. The familiar trail now felt like a path into some alien landscape where the normal rules of nature no longer applied. The Little Missouri River, when we finally reached it, looked wrong too. The water ran darker than usual, almost black in the filtered sunlight, and it moved with an unnatural smoothness that suggested depths far greater than the few feet we knew it to be. No insects danced above its surface, no fish rose to feed, no birds came to drink at its banks. We unpacked our fishing gear in that oppressive silence, going through the motions of a normal family outing while every instinct screamed at us to run. But where could we run to? The trail behind us felt just as threatening as the path ahead, and something told me that whatever was watching us from the shadows wouldn't be deterred by a simple retreat. Rob cast his line into the black water, the splash echoing with unnatural volume in the silence. The sound seemed to reverberate far longer than it should have, as if the forest itself was holding on to it, examining it, deciding what it meant. That's when we heard the first response. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet and the air around us. It was the sound of something vast and hungry, something that had been waiting patiently for us to venture far enough from civilization that our screams would never be heard. Claire grabbed Toby's hand, her face pale with the sudden understanding that this was no longer a family hiking trip. This was a hunt, and we were the prey. The forest pressed closer as we moved upriver, the canopy thickening until only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every rustle in the undergrowth suggested movement just beyond the edge of vision. The thing that had left those impossible tracks was out there somewhere, and I could feel its attention like cold fingers tracing patterns on my spine. Toby stayed close to his mother now, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by the dawning awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The red of his hoodie seemed to pulse in the green gloom like a target, and I found myself wishing he'd chosen less conspicuous clothing for this trip. "How much further to the campground?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Speaking normally felt like a violation of the cathedral silence that had settled over these woods. "Maybe 3 miles, Rob answered, but his usual confidence had evaporated. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand unconsciously resting on the hunting knife at his belt. "We'll take the fire tower route. Higher ground, better visibility." The abandoned fire tower had been a landmark in these parts for decades, a skeletal steel structure left over from the days when human watchers scanned the horizon for the first wisps of smoke. Now it stood like a rusted monument to a time when people still believed they could control the wilderness through vigilance and preparation. As we climbed the gentle slope toward the tower, the wrongness in the air grew thicker, almost tangible. The trees here grew in unnatural patterns, their trunks twisted and bent as if they'd spent years trying to lean away from something that stood where the tower now rose. Bark hung in diseased strips from many of them, and the few leaves that remained were sickly yellow despite the season. "Look at this," Toby said, pointing to deep gouges in the trunk of a massive oak. The scars ran vertically for 8 feet or more, 4 parallel lines too wide to have been made by any normal woodland creature. Whatever had marked this tree possessed claws the length of railroad spikes and the strength to carve through hardwood like soft clay. More trees bore similar marks as we climbed, creating a gallery of wounds that told the story of something enormous moving through these woods on a regular basis. The claws had left patterns that almost looked deliberate, like some form of territorial marking or primitive communication. The fire tower itself came into view through the trees like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its steel frame dark with rust and age. Loblolly pines had grown up around its base, their branches intertwining with the lower supports until it was impossible to tell where nature ended and human construction began. The structure groaned softly in the still air, metal expanding and contracting with barely audible protests. "I want to climb it," Toby announced, his teenage bravado reasserting itself in the face of the adult fear surrounding him. "You can probably see for miles from up there." "Absolutely not," Claire said immediately. But Rob was already studying the tower with the calculating look of someone weighing risks and benefits. "Actually, it might not be a bad idea to get a look around," he said. "If something's tracking us, we need to know where it is." I wanted to argue, but he had a point. The tower would give us a vantage point over the surrounding forest, and its steel frame would provide protection that the open trail couldn't offer. Besides, the alternative was continuing to stumble blindly through woods that felt increasingly hostile with each passing hour. "We'll all go up together," I said, checking the action on the marlin. "Stay close, stay quiet." The tower's stairs were solid despite their age, engineered to support the weight of equipment and multiple people. As we began our ascent, the metal framework created a cage around us, offering the illusion of safety while the forest floor fell away beneath our feet. Halfway up, Toby suddenly stopped, his hand gripping the railing with white knuckles. "Did you guys hear that?" We froze, listening. At first, only the whisper of wind through steel and pine. Then, rising from somewhere below us, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. It was breathing. Deep, rhythmic, deliberately controlled breathing, like something trying very hard to remain quiet while moving through the undergrowth. But this wasn't the breathing of any animal I'd ever encountered. The rhythm was too measured, too intelligent, suggesting a level of conscious control that belonged to higher predators. The breathing paused, as if whatever was making it had suddenly become aware of our presence. In that moment of absolute silence, I could feel eyes upon us, studying us with the patient calculation of something that had done this many times before. Then the steel frame began to vibrate. It started as barely perceptible tremors running through the tower's supports, like the reverberations from some massive impact far below. But the vibrations grew stronger, more rhythmic, as if something enormous was climbing the tower's base with methodical precision. "Move," I hissed, pushing Toby ahead of me up the stairs. "Move now." We scrambled upward as the entire structure began to sway, the ancient bolts and welds protesting under stresses they'd never been designed to handle. Behind us, the rhythmic impacts grew louder, accompanied now by the screech of metal being bent and torn. Claire reached the observation platform first, hauling Toby up beside her with desperate strength. Rob followed, then me, just as something crashed into the tower's base with enough force to crack one of the main supports. From the platform, 40 feet above the forest floor, we could see what was hunting us. The creature stood at the base of the tower on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish fusion of lupine and humanoid characteristics. Its head was wolf-like but broader, the skull massive enough to house a brain capable of complex planning and reasoning. Yellow eyes reflected the filtered sunlight with malevolent intelligence, studying us with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. But it was the creature's arms that truly horrified me. They were too long for its body, muscled like a gorilla's but ending in hands that were almost human except for the black claws that extended from each finger like stiletto blades. Those hands had opposable thumbs, I realized with growing terror. This thing could use tools, manipulate its environment, open doors. The creature tested the tower's stability with one massive hand, then began to climb. It moved with terrifying efficiency, those impossible hands finding purchase on the steel framework with ease. Each movement was calculated and controlled, bringing it steadily closer to our platform while the entire structure groaned under its weight. "The rifle," Claire gasped, but I was already raising the marlin, trying to line up a shot on the thing's center mass. At this range, even a 30-30 should be enough to put it down, assuming it was made of flesh and blood like any normal creature. I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space, the bullet striking the creature square in the chest. It barely staggered, yellow eyes never leaving mine as it continued its methodical ascent. Rob drew his hunting knife, a pathetic gesture against something that size, but the only weapon he had. Toby pressed against the platform's far railing, his young face white with terror as he watched death climbing toward us, one handhold at a time. I fired again, this time aiming for the head. The bullet grazed the creature's skull, tearing away fur and flesh, but it might as well have been a bee sting for all the effect it had. If anything, the wound only seemed to anger it, lips pulling back to reveal teeth like railroad spikes. "The backpack," I shouted to Rob. "Cut Toby's pack loose." Understanding flashed in Rob's eyes. He grabbed Toby's hiking pack and slashed the straps with his knife, then hurled it down at the climbing creature. The pack struck it in the face, and for a moment the thing's grip loosened, but only for a moment. Then it resumed climbing, and I knew we had perhaps 30 seconds before it reached our platform. 30 seconds to live, unless we could find a way to stop 8 feet of predatory nightmare armed with intelligence, claws, and an apparent immunity to small arms fire. That's when Toby did something that probably saved all our lives, though it nearly cost him his own. The boy had been studying the tower's structure with the analytical mind of someone who'd grown up building Lego sets and model airplanes. Now he pointed to a junction where several support beams met near the creature's current position. "There," he shouted. "The stress joint. If you can hit that bolt, the whole section will give way." I could see what he meant. a single massive bolt that held together the convergence of 3 major support beams. If I could shear it with a well-placed shot, this entire section of the tower would collapse, taking the creature with it. I had 2 rounds left in the Marlin's magazine. One chance to make a shot that would demand precision I'd never achieved before, while a nightmare climbed steadily toward my family. The creature was 15 feet below us now, close enough that I could smell its musk, a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else, something that reminded me of old graves and forgotten places. Its breathing had become heavier with the exertion of climbing, but those yellow eyes never left mine, promising that when it reached this platform, my death would be neither quick nor merciful. I drew a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt exploded in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. For a moment, the entire tower structure seemed to hesitate, as if the laws of physics were reconsidering their options. Then reality reasserted itself with a screech of tearing metal that echoed through the forest like the death cry of some mechanical beast. The section of tower beneath us tilted at an impossible angle, support beams bending and snapping as tons of steel found new and unstable configurations. The creature, caught mid-climb, rode the collapsing framework down in a cascade of rust and twisted metal, its yellow eyes never losing their malevolent focus even as it plummeted toward the forest floor. It landed hard among the pine trees, the impact driving it deep into the soft earth and tangled undergrowth. For a moment, blessed silence returned to the forest. Then came a sound that made my spine turn to ice, the creature's breathing, labored but very much alive, followed by the crack of breaking wood as it began to extract itself from the debris. "We have to go," I said, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering my last round. "It's not dead." Below us, the beast emerged from the wreckage like something rising from its own grave. Dark fluid ran from a gash across its skull, and one arm hung at an unnatural angle, but it was moving with the determined purpose of something that had survived far worse than a 40-foot fall. The remaining tower structure swayed dangerously as we descended, the weakened supports groaning under even our modest weight. Behind us, we could hear the creature thrashing through the undergrowth, its injured state doing nothing to diminish the sense of barely contained rage that radiated from it like heat from a furnace. We reached the ground and ran. The forest floor flew beneath our feet as we crashed through undergrowth that seemed to grab at our clothes and equipment with malicious intent. Branches whipped across our faces, and hidden roots tried to send us sprawling with every stride. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer, not just the heavy breathing we'd heard before, but the systematic destruction of everything in the creature's path as it followed our scent trail with predatory persistence. Toby kept pace despite his shorter legs, adrenaline and terror combining to push his 14-year-old body beyond its normal limits. Claire ran with the desperate efficiency of a mother protecting her young, her pack bouncing against her back as she vaulted fallen logs and dodged low-hanging branches. But it was Rob who was falling behind. "Keep going," he gasped, one hand pressed to his side where a stitch was forming. "I'll catch up." "Like hell," Claire shot back, grabbing his arm and hauling him forward. "We stay together." The sound of splintering wood behind us suggested our pursuer was taking a more direct route through the forest than the one we were following. Trees that had stood for decades were being casually destroyed by something that viewed the entire woodland as merely an obstacle to its hunt. We burst out of the tree line, into a small clearing where Little Missouri Creek had carved a natural meadow from the forest. The open space should have felt like a blessing after the claustrophobic confines of the woods, but instead it felt like a trap. Here we were exposed, visible from all directions, with nowhere to hide if our pursuer emerged from the trees. "The creek," I said, pointing to where the water cut across the far side of the clearing. "We can follow it downstream, use the water to mask our scent." But even as we splashed into the cold stream, I knew it was a futile gesture. Whatever was hunting us had already demonstrated abilities that went far beyond normal animal senses. It had found us at the tower despite our elevation advantage, and it was following us now with the confidence of something that had never lost a trail once it decided to hunt. The creek bed provided easier travel than the forest floor, its smooth stones offering solid footing as we made our way downstream. But the water was deeper than it looked, and the current stronger, threatening to sweep us off our feet with every step. That's when we found Rob's baseball cap. It hung from a broken branch 8 feet above the creek, skewered through the crown like some grisly trophy. The fabric was torn, and dark stains around the puncture holes left no doubt about what had put it there. "That's impossible," Rob said, staring up at his own hat with the bewildered expression of someone trying to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with the laws of nature. "I'm wearing it. I never took it off." But when he reached up to touch his head, his fingers found only bare scalp. Somehow, without any of us noticing, the creature had gotten close enough to snatch the cap from Rob's head and impale it on that branch as a message. We weren't being hunted. We were being played with. Claire drew the Glock from her pack, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice before managing to chamber a round. "Where is it?" she whispered, scanning the tree line with eyes wide with primal terror. The answer came in the form of movement in our peripheral vision. Just a shadow sliding between the trees, staying parallel to our course but never revealing itself fully. Then another shadow on the opposite side of the creek, and another behind us. "There's more than one," Toby said in a voice so small it was barely audible above the sound of running water. The shadows resolved into shapes as our pursuers abandoned any pretense of stealth. 3 of them, each easily 7 feet tall, moving through the forest with the coordinated precision of a pack that had hunted together for years. The one from the tower was among them, its injured arm now hanging useless at its side but its predatory focus undimmed. They were driving us, I realized, herding us toward some predetermined destination like wolves driving deer toward a cliff. Every turn we made, every direction we chose, had been anticipated and accommodated. We weren't escaping, we were being guided. The creek curved sharply to the left, cutting through a stand of ancient oaks whose massive trunks created natural barriers on either side. As we rounded the bend, the water grew deeper and faster, forcing us to slow our pace to maintain footing on the slippery stones. That's when they made their move. The first creature emerged from the trees ahead of us, blocking our downstream path with its massive bulk. It stood motionless in the middle of the creek, water flowing around its legs like it was just another boulder in the stream bed. Behind us, the other 2 closed in, their coordination perfect, their timing flawless. We were trapped in a natural amphitheater of stone and water, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The creatures had herded us here with the patience and skill of apex predators who understood their territory better than any human ever could. Claire raised the Glock with both hands, trying to steady her aim on the creature blocking our path. "Get behind me," she told Toby, her voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound brave when every instinct screamed that we were about to die. The creature tilted its massive head, studying her with those terrible yellow eyes. Then it did something that chilled me more than its size or claws or obvious intelligence. It smiled. The expression was alien on that lupine face, but unmistakably human in its malicious amusement. This thing understood exactly what it was doing to us, and it was enjoying every moment of our terror. Claire fired. The bullet struck the creature's center mass, just as mine had at the tower. It staggered slightly, dark fluid spreading across its matted fur, but the wound seemed to have no more effect than a bee sting. If anything, the injury only seemed to amuse it further. "The head," I said, shouldering the marlin and trying to line up a shot on the beast's skull. "Go for the head." But before I could fire, something massive struck me from behind, driving me face first into the cold creek water. Claws raked across my shoulder blades, tearing through fabric and flesh with surgical precision. I rolled sideways, gasping and choking, as one of the other creatures loomed over me with water streaming from its dark fur. The marlin fired as I pulled the trigger reflexively, the bullet going wide and striking nothing but air. Then claws closed around the rifle barrel and tore the weapon from my hands with casual strength, hurling it into the deep water where it disappeared with a splash. Around me, chaos erupted. Claire was screaming Toby's name as the boy stumbled backward from the advancing creatures, his feet slipping on the wet stones. Rob had drawn his hunting knife and was waving it desperately at anything that came within reach, but the blade looked pathetic against opponents who could tear through steel support beams. I fumbled for the hatchet on my belt, knowing it was useless but needing something, anything, to fight back with. The creature above me seemed to sense my desperation and moved with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment before it delivered the killing blow. That's when Toby's voice cut through the chaos like a prayer answered by the most violent god imaginable. "Look out!" Something massive charged from the tree line behind us, snapping saplings like straw as it barreled toward the creek with ground-shaking force. And in the single heartbeat before the impact, I realized it wore the torn backpack Toby had been carrying only minutes earlier, the straps dangling like dark flags from its enormous shoulders. The impact sent creek water exploding in all directions as the newcomer crashed into our attackers with the force of a freight train. But this wasn't rescue, it was competition. The creature wearing Toby's backpack was larger than the others, its massive frame scarred by countless battles, and it had no intention of sharing its prey. What followed was less a fight than a display of territorial dominance, played out with the casual brutality of apex predators who had never learned to fear anything. Claws the length of carving knives tore through hide and muscle as the creatures grappled in the rushing water, their roars echoing off the creek banks like thunder in a contained space. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Toby's arm and hauling him toward the bank. This was our chance. While the beasts were occupied with establishing their pecking order, we could escape upstream where the water grew shallow enough to ford. We scrambled up the muddy bank on hands and knees, Claire still clutching the Glock despite having only a handful of rounds left. Behind us, the battle in the creek reached a crescendo of violence that sent spray 30 feet in every direction, mixed with dark fluid that steamed in the cool air. The forest on this side of the creek felt different. Older, more primal, as if we'd crossed some invisible boundary into a realm where human presence had never been welcome. The trees grew in twisted configurations that hurt to look at directly, their branches intertwining in patterns that suggested intelligence without consciousness, purpose without design. We climbed steadily uphill, following what might once have been a game trail but now seemed more like a path worn by things that walked upright but had never been human. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something organic that had been allowed to rot in places where sunlight never penetrated. "Where are we going?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of our labored breathing. The adrenaline that had carried us this far was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the growing certainty that we were being driven toward something worse than what we'd left behind. "High ground," I said, though I wasn't sure that made tactical sense anymore. Everything we'd learned about wilderness survival assumed you were dealing with normal predators operating under normal rules. These creatures followed their own logic, and elevation advantage meant nothing to something that could climb a 40-foot steel tower with the ease of a squirrel. The trail leveled out onto a ridge of limestone that jutted from the forest like the spine of some buried giant. Ahead of us, a sandstone overhang created a natural shelter that might have been carved by wind and water but looked disturbingly like an open mouth waiting to swallow the unwary. And beneath that overhang, scattered in neat piles that spoke of deliberate arrangement, lay the bones. They weren't old bones, weathered by decades of exposure. These were fresh, some still showing traces of flesh and sinew, arranged in careful stacks according to size and type. Femurs in one pile, ribs in another, skulls grouped together like some grisly collection. Mixed among the human remains were the bones of deer, bear, and smaller animals, but the ratio was disturbingly skewed toward bipedal remains. Cell phone cases glinted in the filtered sunlight, their bright plastic colors garish against the white of sun-bleached bone. Backpacks hung from convenient projections in the rock face, their contents spilled and sorted with the methodical precision of something that had done this many times before. Boots still held the shape of feet that would never need them again, and there, bound with paracord that had been stripped from his own pack, was Toby. He was alive, conscious, his eyes wide with terror but focused on something behind us rather than the horrors that surrounded him. I spun around to find 3 sets of yellow eyes watching us from the shadow of the overhang, studying our reactions with the patient interest of something that had learned to appreciate the full spectrum of human emotion. The largest creature, the one that had attacked the others in the creek, stepped forward into the light. Up close, I could see details that my terror-clouded mind had missed before. Its skull was broader than any wolf's, designed to house a brain capable of complex planning and reasoning. The hands that ended those impossibly long arms were almost human in their dexterity, the opposable thumbs proving that this thing could manipulate tools, open containers, untie knots. It had brought us here. Every turn we'd made, every direction we'd chosen, had been part of an elaborate funnel designed to drive us to this place where it kept its collection. We weren't the first family to take a day hike in the Ouachita National Forest and never return. Claire raised the Glock with both hands, her finger tight on the trigger, but her aim wavered between the 3 creatures as she tried to decide which posed the greatest immediate threat. With only a handful of rounds left, every shot would have to count. "Toby," she called softly, not daring to take her eyes off our captors. "Can you move?" The boy tested his bonds, paracord cutting into his wrists as he tried to work free. But whoever had tied those knots knew what they were doing. The rope was arranged in a configuration that would only tighten if he struggled. The largest creature made a sound that might have been laughter if it had come from a human throat. The noise was wet and grinding, like bone scraping against bone, but the malicious amusement behind it was unmistakable. It was enjoying our reunion, savoring the moment before it separated us permanently. Rob had gone very still, his hunting knife hanging forgotten in his hand as he stared at the collection of remains surrounding us. Among the bones were personal effects he recognized, a distinctive hiking boot he'd seen on a missing person flyer, A watch that belonged to a coworker who'd never returned from a solo camping trip. A child's backpack that had been featured on the local news. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How long has this been going on?" The creature with the injured arm limped forward, dark fluid still seeping from where my rifle bullet had grazed its skull. But the wound hadn't slowed it down significantly, and the look in its yellow eyes promised that my death would be particularly unpleasant. I still had the hatchet at my belt, though it seemed laughably inadequate against opponents who could shrug off rifle fire. But it was all I had, and I'd be damned if I was going to die cowering. The blade came free of its sheath with a whisper of steel on leather. The creature cocked its massive head, studying the weapon with the detached interest of something that had seen many desperate last stands and knew exactly how they all ended. That's when Claire fired her first shot. The bullet took the injured creature in the remaining eye, the impact snapping its head back with enough force to send it staggering into the pile of femurs. For a moment it stood swaying like a drunk, dark fluid streaming down its muzzle. Then it collapsed sideways into the scattered bones, twitching once before lying still. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the stone walls of the overhang like thunder, but the remaining two creatures barely flinched. If anything, they seemed pleased that the weakest member of their group had been culled. The pack hierarchy was now clearer, the division of spoils simplified. Claire aimed at the largest creature, but before she could fire, it moved with speed that defied its bulk. One massive hand swept the Glock aside while the other closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground with casual strength. I charged with the hatchet raised, knowing it was suicide but unable to watch my sister die without trying to help. The blade bit deep into the creature's back, sinking to the handle between its shoulder blades. It roared and spun, releasing Claire to deal with this new annoyance, claws raking across my ribs as I tried to dodge sideways. The hatchet remained buried in its back, beyond my reach now, but the wound seemed to have no more effect than a splinter would on a normal man. The creature turned to face me with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment before it ended my pathetic resistance. But Claire wasn't finished. She'd retrieved the Glock from where it had fallen, and now she put 3 rounds into the beast's skull at point-blank range. This time, the concentrated fire had an effect. The creature's head cratered inward, yellow eyes going dark as it toppled backward into the bone pile. The third creature watched this display with academic interest, as if taking notes on effective killing techniques. When Claire swung the pistol toward it, the beast simply stepped aside with fluid grace, allowing her shots to spark harmlessly off the stone wall behind it. It was toying with us, I realized. This thing could have killed us all at any point during our flight through the forest, but it had chosen instead to drive us here for its own entertainment. Our terror was seasoning for the meal to come. The Glock clicked empty. Claire stared at the useless weapon in her hands with the blank expression of someone whose last hope had just evaporated. Around us, the walls of the overhang seemed to pulse with malevolent life, as if the stone itself was hungry for the blood about to be spilled. The surviving creature approached with predatory confidence, its yellow eyes reflecting what little light filtered into the boneyard. This close, I could see intelligence there, not animal cunning but genuine reasoning ability. This thing understood concepts like fear, hope, and despair. It knew exactly what it was doing to us, and it was enjoying every moment. That's when Toby spoke up from where he lay bound among the scattered remains. "The bones," he said, his voice cracking with adolescent fear but his mind still working with the analytical precision that had saved us at the tower. "Look at how they're arranged." I followed his gaze, seeing the bone piles with new eyes. They weren't random collections, they were organized according to some system that spoke of ritual or ceremony. The skulls faced inward toward a central point where dark stains in the stone suggested regular blood offerings. The long bones were arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. This wasn't just a feeding ground, it was a shrine. The creature paused in its approach, yellow eyes flicking toward the bone arrangements as if suddenly aware that its sanctuary had been observed and analyzed. For the first time since this nightmare began, uncertainty flickered across its alien features. "It's not random," Toby continued, his teenage voice growing stronger as his mind engaged with the puzzle before him. "The pattern, it's like a circuit, or a maze. Everything flows toward the center." I could see what he meant now. The bone piles weren't just trophies, they were components in some vast design that covered the entire floor of the overhang. Femurs and ribs formed concentric circles around that central stained area, while smaller bones filled in connecting patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. The creature made a sound that might have been displeasure, or perhaps warning. It didn't like having its sacred space examined too closely by prey that should have been cowering in terror. But Toby's observation had revealed something important. This thing followed rules. operated according to some internal logic that went beyond simple predation. The skulls, I said, studying the arrangement more carefully. They're all facing the same direction, not inward toward the center as I'd first thought, but outward toward specific points on the compass. North, south, east, west, the cardinal directions marked by clusters of human and animal skulls that seemed to be standing guard over something. The creature's agitation grew more pronounced. It began pacing in tight circles, claws clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that matched the pattern of the bone arrangements. Whatever we were seeing, we weren't supposed to understand it. Claire had been quietly working her way toward where Toby lay bound, using the creature's distraction to close the distance. Now she knelt beside her son, her fingers working at the paracord knots with desperate efficiency. "Almost got it," she whispered, not daring to look up from her task. The rope was tight, cutting into Toby's wrists, but she could feel it beginning to give way under her persistent efforts. The creature suddenly stopped pacing and fixed its attention on Claire's rescue attempt. It took a step forward, lips pulling back to reveal those railroad spike teeth, but something held it back, some rule or restriction that prevented it from simply ending our lives whenever it chose. "The center," Toby said suddenly. "I think we have to get to the center." The dark stains in the stone floor marked a roughly circular area about 6 feet across, surrounded by the innermost ring of bones. Whatever rituals had been conducted here over the years had left permanent marks in the limestone, dark patches that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But as I studied the central area more carefully, I realized it wasn't just stained, it was carved. Symbols had been etched into the stone, primitive markings that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to move and shift when observed, creating patterns that suggested meaning without offering comprehension. The creature was becoming increasingly agitated, its pacing more frantic now. It would approach us, then retreat, then approach again, as if fighting against invisible restraints that limited its actions. The yellow eyes darted constantly between us and the bone arrangements, calculating something I couldn't understand. "Got it," Claire breathed, and the paracord fell away from Toby's wrists. The boy rubbed circulation back into his hands while his mother helped him to his feet, both of them staying low to avoid drawing the creature's attention. But avoidance was no longer an option. The beast had made its decision, whatever internal struggle it had been fighting now resolved. It charged toward us with ground-shaking force, claws extended, jaws open in a roar that echoed off the stone walls like the voice of the mountain itself. I dove sideways, tackling Claire and Toby and rolling all three of us toward the center of the boneyard. We landed hard among the scattered remains, ribs and vertebrae clattering around us like macabre wind chimes. The creature's charge carried it past us, claws raking gouges in the stone where we'd been standing moments before. But as soon as we crossed into the central circle, everything changed. The creature stopped as if it had hit an invisible wall, yellow eyes widening with something that might have been fear. It prowled around the perimeter of the central area, testing the boundaries with tentative swipes of its claws, but something prevented it from entering the circle where we huddled among the dark stains and carved symbols. "It can't come in here," Rob said wonderingly. He'd been forgotten during the chaos, standing frozen among the bone piles like a statue, but now he approached the circle's edge with growing confidence. "There's something about this place, some kind of protection." The creature's agitation reached a fever pitch. It threw back its head and howled, a sound that combined the fury of an apex predator with the frustration of something bound by rules it couldn't break. The howl was answered from the forest beyond the overhang, distant voices that spoke of others of its kind, perhaps summoned by the call of their pack leader. "We can't stay here forever," Claire said, pulling Toby close as the sounds of approaching predators grew louder. "Whatever's protecting this circle, it won't help us if we're surrounded." I studied the carved symbols more carefully, trying to understand the logic behind the protection they offered. The markings seemed familiar somehow, reminiscent of Native American petroglyphs I'd seen in other parts of Arkansas, but these were older, more primitive, carved by people who understood things about the natural world that modern science had forgotten. "It's a boundary," I said finally. "These symbols, they're marking territory. This place belongs to something else, something the creature respects or fears." The howling from the forest was getting closer now, multiple voices joining in a chorus that spoke of pack coordination and shared purpose. Whatever had protected this central area from one creature might not be enough to hold back an entire hunting party. Toby was examining the symbols with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose solution meant survival. "Look at the patterns," he said. "They're not random either. It's like a map or instructions." He was right. The carved markings formed pathways that connected the various symbols, creating a network of lines that flowed around the central area like rivers converging on a lake. But some of the pathways led outward, toward the edges of the overhang and beyond. There, he pointed to a series of connected symbols that curved toward the back of the shelter. That sequence leads somewhere, maybe a way out. I followed the pattern he'd identified, noting how the carved lines seemed to guide the eye toward a section of the back wall that looked subtly different from the surrounding stone. Closer examination revealed what might have been a natural fissure in the limestone, wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were desperate enough. The howling outside reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, we could hear the sound of multiple heavy bodies moving through the undergrowth, approaching our sanctuary with coordinated precision. Whatever protection this place offered, we were about to test its limits. The creature that had been stalking us stepped back from the circle's edge, yellow eyes fixed on something beyond our vision. A moment later, two more of its kind emerged from the forest shadows, both larger than any we'd encountered before. These were the pack leaders, the apex predators that ruled this territory through strength and cunning accumulated over decades of successful hunts. But they too stopped at the circle's edge, unwilling or unable to cross into the protected space. Instead, they began to pace around the perimeter, testing for weaknesses, probing for some way to reach the prey that had taken sanctuary in forbidden ground. "Now," I said, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her toward the back wall. While they're focused on the circle, we moved in a crouched run, staying low among the bone piles, using the scattered remains as cover while we approached the fissure in the limestone. Behind us, the creature's pacing grew more agitated as they realized their prey was escaping toward an exit they couldn't prevent us from using. The opening in the rock face was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through sideways, but it led somewhere. Cool air flowed from the gap, carrying scents of deep earth and running water. Another way out, perhaps a back entrance to the cave system that honeycombed this part of the Ouachita Mountains. "Me first," I said, though every instinct screamed against turning my back on the creatures prowling just outside the circle's protection. Then Toby, then Claire, then Rob. I pressed into the fissure, feeling limestone scrape against my shoulders as I forced my way through the narrow opening. The passage angled downward at a steep slope, disappearing into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. But anything was better than staying trapped in a boneyard surrounded by patient predators. One by one, my family followed me into the crack in the mountain, leaving behind the carved symbols and scattered remains that had provided temporary sanctuary. Behind us, the creature's howls of frustration echoed through the chamber, but the sounds grew fainter as we descended into the earth's embrace. The passage opened into a larger cavern where underground springs had carved galleries in the living rock. Phosphorescent minerals in the walls provided just enough light to navigate by, revealing a network of tunnels that stretched away into the mountain's heart. "Which way?" Rob asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. I listened carefully, trying to detect air currents that might indicate passages leading to the surface. From somewhere ahead came the sound of running water, not the trickle of underground seepage, but the rush of a substantial stream, water that had to be flowing somewhere, possibly toward daylight. "Follow the water," I said, choosing a tunnel that angled downward toward the sound of the stream. "It has to lead out eventually." We moved through the darkness with our hands on each other's shoulders, feeling our way along passages carved by millions of years of patient water. The air grew cooler as we descended, carrying scents that spoke of the deep places where sunlight never penetrated and life followed different rules. But even here, in the heart of the mountain, we weren't safe. Behind us, echoing through the limestone galleries, came the sound of something large forcing its way through the fissure we'd used to escape. The creatures had found another way to follow us, squeezing their massive frames through openings that should have been too small to accommodate them. The hunt was far from over. We reached the underground stream just as the pursuit sounds grew close enough to suggest our hunters had mastered the cave system's geography. The water ran swift and cold, disappearing into a tunnel that curved away into absolute darkness. "We'll have to swim," I said, testing the current with one foot. The stream was deeper than it looked and fast enough to carry us away from immediate danger if we could avoid being swept into underwater obstacles. One by one, we lowered ourselves into the frigid water, gasping as the cold shocked our systems into hyper-alertness. The current grabbed us immediately, pulling us downstream toward whatever exit the water had carved through the mountain's bones. Behind us, yellow eyes reflected the cave's faint phosphorescence as our pursuers reached the underground river. But the creatures stopped at the water's edge, unwilling to follow us into the submerged passages where their size would become a disadvantage rather than an asset. The current carried us through darkness that was absolute. Our only guide, the feel of water rushing past limestone walls worn smooth by countless years of erosion. Sometimes the tunnel opened into larger chambers where we could gasp for air before being swept onward. Sometimes it narrowed until we had to duck our heads to avoid scraping against the ceiling. Then, impossibly, we saw light ahead. Not the artificial glow of phosphorescent minerals, but genuine daylight filtered through water and stone. The underground river was carrying us toward an exit, a natural sinkhole where the stream emerged from the mountain's heart into the afternoon sun. We surfaced in a pool surrounded by limestone bluffs, gasping and shivering but alive. Above us, the sky was deep blue, unmarked by clouds, beautiful in its ordinary simplicity after the nightmare darkness of the caves. "The truck," Claire said, recognizing landmarks visible from our current position. "We're less than a mile from the parking area." We hauled ourselves out of the water and began the final push toward civilization, toward lights and locked doors, and the comforting illusion that monsters didn't exist in the modern world. But even as we stumbled through the forest toward safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The creatures had let us go, I realized. They could have followed us through the water if they'd chosen to, could have waited at the sinkhole to finish what they'd started. Instead, they'd allowed us to escape with our lives and our sanity mostly intact. But at what cost? And what would we tell the authorities about what we'd found in those woods? By the time we reached the truck, the sun was setting behind the Awachita Mountains, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded me too much of the stains in that limestone circle. We drove in silence toward the lights of civilization, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced and what it meant. I stopped only once during that drive, at a roadside rest area where I doused the marlin and hatchet with gasoline and dropped them in a dumpster. Some things didn't belong in the daylight world, and the weapons that had failed to protect us in the forest would only serve as reminders of how helpless we'd been against forces beyond our understanding. That Watcha National Forest still keeps its own dark law, and whatever enforcement that law requires has heirs that hunt in the shadows between civilization and wilderness. We left those woods carrying one truth I wish I'd never learned, that there are older powers in this world than human reason can explain. And they're still very much alive in the places where we're not welcome. The paperwork would list our injuries as the result of a hiking accident. The missing persons reports for all those other families would remain unsolved, and the boneyard beneath that limestone overhang would continue to grow, one careful collection at a time, hidden in a place where the old rules still apply, and trespassers pay the ultimate price for their ignorance. Some doors once opened can never be fully closed again. And some hunts never truly end, they just pause, waiting patiently for the next group of prey foolish enough to venture into territory where humans were never meant to walk. My Cherokee name is Amadahi, forest water, given to me by my grandmother 7 days after my birth, following the ancient traditions of our people. The name proved prophetic, as I've spent my entire adult life as a park ranger in the Appalachian wilderness, where the mountain streams run like veins through the dense Carolina forest. My family has walked these mountains for countless generations, long before they became part of the national park system, back when the Cherokee Nation stretched across 40,000 square miles of sacred land. The old ones in my family speak of things that move in the deepest parts of the forest, things that existed here long before European boots first trampled our hunting paths. Grandmother used to tell me stories of Kitawa, the ancient ones who guarded the forest's darkest secrets. She claimed our bloodline held a special responsibility, passed down through the matrilineal tradition, to serve as watchers and protectors of the boundary between the world of humans and the world of shadows. I thought they were just stories until the autumn of 2024, when 3 hikers vanished without a trace in the remote sections of my district. The first call came on a Tuesday morning, October 15th. The fog hung thick between the mountains like the breath of sleeping giants. Dispatch crackled through my radio. Ranger Station 7, we have a missing persons report. 3 college students from the University of Tennessee, last seen on the Appalachian Trail near Cataract Falls. I knew that section well, too well. It was where my great-grandfather had warned me never to venture alone, especially during the changing of seasons when the veil grows thin. The area was notorious among the local Cherokee families, though the Park Service had never documented any unusual incidents there. We simply referred to it as DU, the place where spirits dwell. The missing hikers were Sarah Chen, Marcus Wright, and Jessica Taylor, all 22 years old and experienced backpackers. Their planned route would have taken them through some of the most remote terrain in the park, where cell phone coverage disappears and the ancient forest reclaims its primordial silence. According to their filed itinerary, they should have emerged at the Chimney Tops trailhead 3 days earlier. I began my search at dawn the following day, accompanied by Deputy Martinez from the county sheriff's department and Ranger Thompson, a 15-year veteran who'd seen his share of wilderness emergencies. The morning air carried an unusual stillness. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, just the whisper of wind through autumn leaves that seemed to watch our every step. We followed the established trail for the first 6 miles, checking for any sign the hikers had deviated from their planned route. At Cataract Falls, we discovered their first campsite, abandoned but intact. Their tent stakes remained driven into the ground, gear scattered as if they'd left in extreme haste. Strange scratches marked the nearby trees, too high and too deep to be made by any known predator in these mountains. "Jesus," Thompson muttered, running his fingers along the gouges in the bark. "What the hell could make marks like these?" I knelt beside the cold fire ring, examining the ashes. My grandmother had taught me to read signs in disturbed earth and scattered stones. The ashes held no warmth, but they told a story of terror. The logs had been scattered frantically, as if someone had tried to build the fire larger, brighter, desperate to keep something at bay. Deputy Martinez photographed the scene while I circled the campsite searching for tracks. What I found made my blood run cold. Alongside the hikers' boot prints, I discovered impressions I'd hoped never to see. Massive human-like footprints, but wrong in every proportion. They measured nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with an elongated heel and distinctly separated toe impressions that suggested incredible strength and weight. The tracks led northwest, away from any established trail, into the deep forest where the canopy grows so thick that noon feels like twilight. They followed an ancient game trail that appeared on no Park Service map, a path that my ancestors would have recognized as leading to the heart of the mountain's spiritual center. As we prepared to follow the trail, I felt the first stirring of something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The sensation my grandmother called atsila dohi, the awareness that unseen eyes were watching. The forest seemed to pulse around us, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Thompson checked his radio, but static was all that answered his attempts to contact base camp. "We're on our own out here," he said, his voice tight with growing unease. I touched the medicine pouch my grandmother had given me, feeling the smooth river stones and dried herbs that connected me to generations of Cherokee wisdom. The old stories whispered in my mind, tales of Kekla Kudla, the ancient forest guardian my people called Sasquatch long before European settlers gave it that name. According to the legends, it was neither entirely benevolent nor malevolent, but something far more complex, a protector of the sacred places who would defend them against any intrusion, regardless of the intruder's intentions. The day was dying when we made the decision to establish our own camp and continue the search at first light. As darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds that defied explanation. Massive footsteps circling our camp, staying just beyond the reach of our firelight. Twice during the night I heard what could only be described as a low, mournful call echoing through the valleys. A sound that spoke of intelligence and profound sadness. When morning came, our fire had been rebuilt during the night. Fresh wood had been stacked nearby, and the coals glowed with impossible warmth. None of us had awakened, yet someone, or something, had tended our fire through the darkest hours, keeping us safe from the mountain cold. The second day of our search began with a discovery that challenged everything I thought I knew about these mountains. Fresh footprints circled our campsite, not the massive tracks we'd found earlier, but the familiar boot prints of the missing hikers. They led directly to our fire pit, where someone had carefully arranged stones in a pattern I recognized from my grandmother's teachings. "They were here," I whispered, studying the arrangement. 7 stones placed in a sacred circle, each representing one of the traditional Cherokee clans. It was a message, a sign that whoever left it understood our ancient ways. Martinez and Thompson exchanged worried glances. "That's impossible," Thompson said. "We've been here all night. Nobody could have approached without waking us." But I knew better. My grandmother had told me stories of how the forest could fold space and time, allowing those under its protection to move unseen between the worlds of the living and the dead. The stone circle wasn't just a message, it was a warning that we were venturing into a realm where normal rules no longer applied. We broke camp quickly, following the new trail that led deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The path wound through groves of ancient hemlocks and rhododendron thickets, so dense they formed natural tunnels. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy like golden spears, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with moss that seemed to glow with its own inner light. 3 miles from our camp, we discovered something that made no sense according to any Park Service map or geological survey: a natural stone archway, worn smooth by countless centuries of wind and water, that framed a view of a hidden valley below. The valley shouldn't have existed in this location, yet there it was, a pocket of wilderness that time seemed to have forgotten. "This isn't on any of our charts," Thompson said, consulting his topographical map. "How is that possible?" I peered into the valley through my binoculars, searching for any sign of the missing hikers. What I saw instead was far more disturbing: structures that looked almost like buildings, but made entirely from living trees whose branches had been woven together with impossible precision. Smoke rose from what might have been cooking fires, and shadowy figures moved between the tree houses with a grace that suggested they were more than human. "There," Martinez pointed to a clearing near the center of the valley. "Do you see that?" I adjusted my focus and felt my heart leap. 3 small figures sat in a circle around a larger shape that could only be described as massive and covered in dark fur. Even at this distance, I could see that the 3 humans appeared to be unharmed, perhaps even comfortable in their strange captivity. "Those have to be our hikers," I said, lowering the binoculars, "but they don't look like prisoners." The descent into the valley took us most of the afternoon, following a treacherous path that seemed to have been carved from the cliff face by hands that understood the mountain's secret passages. With each step downward, the air grew warmer and filled with scents I couldn't identify, herbs and flowers that bloomed nowhere else in these mountains, and something else, something that spoke to the deepest parts of my Cherokee heritage. As we approached the valley floor, the trees themselves seemed to watch our progress. I noticed that many bore markings similar to the scratches we'd found at the abandoned campsite, but these were older, worn smooth by decades of weather. They formed patterns that reminded me of the sacred symbols my grandmother had shown me: protective wards and boundary markers that warned of sacred ground. The first building we encountered was a marvel of natural architecture. Living oak and maple trees had been guided to grow in precise patterns, their branches intertwining to form walls and a roof that filtered sunlight into a comfortable green-tinted illumination. Herbs and vegetables grew in carefully tended gardens between the structures, maintained by methods that seemed to blend Cherokee agricultural wisdom with something far older and more mysterious. And then we saw him. The creature that stepped from behind one of the tree houses was everything the legends had described and more. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a professional bodybuilder, he was covered in dense dark fur that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. His face was profoundly human yet utterly alien. Intelligent eyes that held depths of knowledge and sadness, a broad nose and mouth that spoke of gentle intelligence rather than bestial savagery. But what struck me most was the way he moved. There was no aggression in his posture, no threat in his careful approach. Instead, he carried himself with the dignity of a tribal elder, someone accustomed to responsibility and leadership. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, forming words in a language that was almost Cherokee, but older, more primal. "Sio Duyuktevi," he said, offering a traditional greeting. "Amadahi Duyuktevi Aya." My heart nearly stopped. He knew my name. Not only that, he spoke it with the proper Cherokee pronunciation and inflection, as if he'd known me all my life. "You understand," I replied in Cherokee, my voice barely above a whisper. The great creature nodded solemnly. "Your grandmother spoke of you often, young forest water. She said you would come when the time was right, when the old boundaries began to weaken and the sacred places needed new guardians." Behind him, the 3 missing hikers emerged from the largest treehouse. They appeared healthy and rested, though their eyes held a strange quality, the look of people who had witnessed wonders beyond ordinary human comprehension. Sarah Chen stepped forward first, her expression mixing relief with reluctance. "Ranger Amadahi," she called. "We're okay, more than okay actually, but we need to tell you what we've learned. About the forest, about why we were brought here, and about the danger that's coming." The creature I now knew must be Kekle Kudle gestured for us to follow him toward the central gathering place of the valley. As we walked, I noticed that Martinez and Thompson moved as if in a dream, their usual professional alertness replaced by a kind of peaceful acceptance that suggested the valley's influence extended beyond mere human understanding. "The hunters will come soon," Sarah continued, her voice urgent despite her obvious exhaustion. "Men with weapons and equipment, following the stories that have started spreading about Bigfoot sightings in the park. They don't understand what they're hunting, and if they succeed in finding this place..." She didn't need to finish. I understood. The sacred valley, the ancient guardian, the delicate balance that had protected these mountains for countless generations, all of it hung by a thread. And I was about to learn that my family's old stories were not legends at all, but warnings of a responsibility I was about to inherit. The circle where Kekla led us was a natural amphitheater formed by ancient trees whose trunks had grown in a perfect spiral, creating ascending levels of smooth, moss-covered seats. At the center, a spring bubbled up from deep underground, its water so clear it seemed to glow with its own light. This was clearly a place of great power, where important decisions had been made for countless generations. As we settled into seats carved from living wood, Sarah, Marcus, and Jessica began to tell their story. What they revealed challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between my people and the ancient guardians of the forest. "We weren't lost," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "We were called. 3 nights before our hike, each of us had the same dream. A voice speaking in a language we didn't understand, showing us images of this valley, of the path we needed to follow." Marcus nodded, still clearly processing what he'd experienced. "The voice told us to bring specific things. Herbs from Sarah's ethnobotany research, my recording equipment, and Jessica's first aid supplies. We thought it was just a weird coincidence, but now we understand we were summoned to serve as witnesses," Jessica finished. "To learn the truth and carry it back to the outside world, if we chose to." Kekla settled his massive form onto a natural throne formed by interwoven roots, his presence both intimidating and reassuring. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of ages. For 7 generations, he began in his archaic Cherokee, which I translated for Martinez and Thompson. "Your family has served as the bridge between my people and yours. Your great-grandmother was the last to walk these hidden paths, before the world of metal and noise grew too loud for most humans to hear the old voices." I felt a chill of recognition. My great-grandmother had disappeared when I was 7 years old, during a solo hike she'd insisted on taking despite her advanced age. The family had searched for weeks, but her body was never found. The official report listed her as a victim of exposure or wild animal attack. But now I wondered if she'd simply chosen to step permanently into this hidden world. "The balance is breaking," Kekla continued. "Men come to these mountains with machines that poison the water and clear-cut the sacred groves. They hunt not for food or necessity but for profit and fame. Some seek to capture or kill my people for exhibition, others to exploit the sacred sites for their mineral wealth." As he spoke, images began to form in the spring's surface, like looking into a television screen made of water. I saw surveying teams taking measurements in restricted areas of the park, hunters with sophisticated equipment following tracks through the wilderness, and worst of all, construction vehicles parked just beyond the park boundaries waiting for legal challenges to be resolved so development could begin. "The old protections are failing," Sarah said softly. "The treaties your ancestors made with the forest guardians, the spiritual barriers that kept this place hidden, they're weakening because too few people remember the old ways." Thompson, who had been unusually quiet throughout this explanation, finally spoke. "I've been a ranger for 15 years. I've seen things in these woods that don't make it into my reports because nobody would believe them. Sounds in the night, tracks that disappear mid-stride, areas where electronic equipment fails for no reason." He looked directly at Kekla. "You've been protecting us all this time, haven't you? Keeping the dangerous things away from the tourists and day hikers." The great guardian nodded gravely. "My people have walked these mountains since the ice retreated and the first trees took root. We remember when your ancestors first came here, when the treaties were made in blood and spirit smoke. We have honored those agreements, even as the world forgot them existed." Martinez was frantically taking notes, his police training overwhelmed by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "How many of you are there?" he asked. "Fewer each generation," came the sad reply. "The deep forests grow smaller. The sacred sites are forgotten or destroyed. My mate died 3 winters ago when loggers poisoned the river where she bore our young. I am the last guardian of this territory, and when I pass, the protections will die with me." The weight of that revelation settled over us like a stone. I thought of all the stories my grandmother had told me, all the warnings about responsibility and the price of forgetting the old ways. Now I understood why she'd insisted I learn the traditional Cherokee language, why she'd made me memorize the sacred songs and ceremonies, why she'd always spoken of my future in the forest as if it were predetermined. "There's more," Jessica said quietly. "Show them the others." Kekla gestured toward the spring, and new images formed in its depths. What I saw made my blood freeze. Hunters moving through the forest with military-grade equipment, night vision scopes, and tranquilizer weapons. They weren't ordinary Bigfoot enthusiasts or trophy hunters. These were professionals, well-funded and well-organized, moving with the precision of a military operation. "They call themselves the Cryptid Acquisition Foundation," Marcus explained. "They've been tracking unexplained phenomena across the country, capturing or killing anything they can't classify. They arrived in the area 2 days ago, setting up a base camp just outside the park boundary. They have new weapons," Kekla added, his voice heavy with concern. "Not the simple bullets and traps of previous hunters. These shoot darts that carry sleeping poison, and they have machines that track scent through the air. Worst of all, they have learned to follow the spirit paths, the hidden ways between the worlds." I felt the medicine pouch around my neck grow warm, responding to the danger that threatened not just the valley but the entire spiritual ecosystem my ancestors had spent generations protecting. The responsibility I'd been running from my entire adult life was now unavoidable. "What do you need from us?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The ancient guardian's eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of centuries. "The old compact must be renewed, but it requires a blood descendant of the original treaty makers. Your great-grandmother was to have passed the knowledge to you, but her time ended before she could complete the teaching." "You're talking about some kind of ceremony," I said, my mouth dry with sudden understanding. "A joining," he corrected. "For you to become a true guardian, a bridge between the worlds. Some of your human nature must be surrendered. You will gain the ability to walk the spirit paths, to see through the forest's eyes, to command the respect of both my people and the wild things that serve them. But the change cannot be undone." I looked at my companions, Thompson and Martinez, who had become unlikely witnesses to something beyond their training or experience, and the 3 hikers who had been chosen to carry this knowledge back to the world. The choice before me wasn't just personal. It would determine whether the last sacred places in these mountains survived or fell to the advancing tide of development and exploitation. Outside the valley, night was falling, and with it came the sounds of distant engines. The hunters were getting closer. The sounds of approaching vehicles grew louder as darkness settled over the hidden valley, their mechanical rumble a harsh discord against the forest's natural symphony. Kekla rose from his throne of roots, his massive form moving with surprising grace as he began preparations for what he called the Gadugi Atsila, the sacred joining that would either save the valley or mark its final hours. "Time grows short," he said, gesturing for me to follow him to a grove of 7 ancient oak trees that formed a natural circle. "The hunters have found the spirit path. They will breach the valley's defenses within 2 hours." Sarah, Marcus, and Jessica gathered their belongings while Thompson and Martinez established a defensive perimeter, their police and ranger training kicking in despite the surreal circumstances. I could see the conflict in their eyes. Duty warred with disbelief. Protocol clashed with the undeniable evidence of their own senses. The oak grove pulsed with spiritual energy so intense I could feel it in my bones. Each tree bore carved symbols that predated written Cherokee language, spirals and animal forms that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of Kekla torch. At the center of the circle, a flat stone altar was inlaid with quartz crystals that caught and amplified the firelight. "Your great-grandmother stood here once," the guardian explained as he began mixing herbs in a wooden bowl. "She chose to join with the forest rather than watch it fall to those who would exploit it. Her spirit walks these paths still, waiting to welcome you to the deeper mysteries." I felt her presence then, a warmth in the medicine pouch around my neck and whisper of Cherokee words carried on the wind. "Amadahi, grandson of my heart, the time has come to take up the burden our family has carried for 7 generations." The ritual itself was unlike anything in my formal training in Cherokee traditions. Kekla painted my face and hands with a mixture of clay and herbs that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, while chanting in a language that was older than Cherokee, older perhaps than human speech itself. As the words washed over me, I felt my perception beginning to shift and expand. The forest around us became alive in ways I'd never imagined. I could sense the consciousness of every tree, feel the network of roots and fungal connections that linked them in a vast, thinking web. The very mountains pulsed with slow, deep thoughts that spanned geological ages, and beneath it all flowed the ancient presence of the guardians, beings who had chosen to merge their essence with the land itself. "Drink," Quetzalcoatl commanded, offering me a cup filled with liquid that tasted of spring water and starlight. "Let the forest take root in your soul." The transformation began immediately. My human senses expanded beyond their normal limits. I could hear the heartbeats of small animals miles away, smell the approach of rain still hours distant, and see through the darkness as clearly as if it were noon. But more than that, I gained access to the spirit paths, the hidden routes between worlds that allowed guardians to step instantly from one part of the forest to another. Pain accompanied the change as if every cell in my body was being rewritten. My bones grew denser, my muscles stronger, and my skin developed a subtle pattern of markings visible only in certain light. When the transformation completed, I was still recognizably human, but something more, a bridge between the world of flesh and the realm of spirit. "Welcome, Forest Guardian," Quetzalcoatl said, offering me his massive hand. "Now you can see what approaches." Through my enhanced senses, I perceived the hunter's true nature. They weren't simply well-equipped enthusiasts. They were backed by corporate interests that saw the cryptid phenomenon as a source of immense profit. Capture a living Sasquatch, and the media rights alone would be worth millions. Prove the existence of undiscovered species, and the pharmaceutical companies would pay billions for access to their unique biology. Their leader was a man named Crawford, a former Special Forces operator who specialized in tracking and capturing dangerous wildlife. His team included a biologist, a cryptozoologist, and 2 security specialists armed with weapons that fired tranquilizer darts containing experimental sedatives designed specifically for large, unknown mammals. "They have found the first barrier," Quetzalcoatl warned. "Your friends must leave now, or risk being captured with us." But Thompson stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "I'm not abandoning my post. If this valley is part of my district, then it's my responsibility to protect it." Martinez nodded agreement. "Besides, we're the only ones who can file official reports about what's happening here. The outside world needs to know." Sarah, Marcus, and Jessica exchanged glances before Sarah spoke for all of them. "We came here to witness the truth. We're not leaving until we see how this ends." I felt a surge of gratitude and terror in equal measure. These 6 people had chosen to stand with us against forces they barely understood, risking their careers, their freedom, and possibly their lives to protect something that most of the world would dismiss as fantasy. The sound of the hunters' vehicles grew closer, accompanied now by the electronic whine of their tracking equipment. Through my enhanced connection to the forest, I could sense them cutting through the spiritual barriers that had protected the valley for centuries, using technology that somehow interfaced with the ancient energies. "They have a guide," Quetzalcoatl said suddenly, his voice tight with shock and anger. "One who knows the old ways. Someone has betrayed the trust." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Only a few dozen people in the world still knew the traditional methods for finding the hidden places, and most of them were Cherokee elders who would die before revealing such secrets. But money could corrupt even the most sacred traditions, and the corporations backing Crawford would have resources to tempt even the most honorable people. "We must prepare for battle," Quetzalcoatl declared, reaching for weapons that had been hidden in the oak trees. Not modern firearms, but tools crafted from wood and stone and imbued with protective spirits. "They seek to capture rather than kill, which gives us an advantage. But if they succeed in taking me alive, every guardian sanctuary in North America will fall." As I took up my own weapon, a staff carved from mountain ash and tipped with river stone, I felt the weight of 7 generations of Cherokee guardians settling on my shoulders. My great-grandmother's spirit whispered final words of guidance. "Remember, grandson, you fight not just for the valley but for the soul of the mountains themselves." The first vehicle appeared at the valley's rim, its searchlights cutting through the darkness like mechanical lightning. The final battle for the heart of the ancient forest was about to begin. The assault began at midnight, when the barrier between worlds grows thinnest and spiritual energies flow most freely. Crawford's team descended into the valley using military repelling techniques, their night vision equipment painting the sacred grove in ghostly green light. But they moved with more than tactical precision. Their Cherokee guide had taught them to avoid the marked trees, to step around the spirit stones, to show just enough respect for the old powers to keep from triggering the valley's deadliest defenses. I recognized the guide as soon as he emerged from the shadows. William Sequoia, a distant cousin whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to corporate recruitment. The knowledge he'd sold them wasn't just geographical, it included the sacred Cherokee names for the guardian spirits, The words needed to temporarily pacify the forest's protective consciousness. Betrayer, Quetzalcoatl's voice thundered through the valley, carrying centuries of accumulated rage. Your ancestors weep in the spirit world. Sequoia flinched but continued guiding the hunters toward our position. I could see Crawford's plan unfolding. Surround the grove, use tranquilizer darts to incapacitate Quetzalcoatl, then extract him before the forest could mount an organized defense. It might have worked against an ordinary animal, but they were hunting something far more dangerous than they understood. The first shots came without warning. Darts fired from concealed positions around the grove's perimeter. But my enhanced senses had tracked each hunter's approach, and I moved through the spirit paths to intercept the projectiles before they could reach their target. The darts struck the oak trees instead, their sedatives hissing harmlessly into bark that had been hardened by centuries of protective magic. "Return fire," Crawford shouted, realizing his initial advantage was lost. What followed was unlike any battle in recorded history. A conflict between modern military technology and ancient forest magic fought in a hidden valley that existed partially outside normal space-time. Thompson and Martinez used their firearms training to pin down the hunters' advanced positions, while Sarah, Marcus, and Jessica helped me coordinate the forest's active defenses. Through my connection to the Guardian network, I could command every living thing in the valley. Vines erupted from the ground to entangle the hunters' feet, while owls and hawks dove from the canopy to disrupt their night vision equipment. The very trees began to move, their branches reaching like grasping fingers to knock weapons from human hands. But Crawford's team adapted quickly to each escalation. Their biologist produced a spray that wilted the attacking vines, while their security specialists switched to weapons that fired nets designed to contain large, aggressive animals. For every advantage we gained, they countered with technology specifically designed to overcome supernatural defenses. The turning point came when Sequoia guided them to the spring at the heart of the grove. I watched in horror as Crawford's cryptozoologist began collecting water samples, disrupting the sacred pool's surface and severing its connection to the spirit world. Without that link, many of our mystical defenses began to fail. "The source is compromised," Quetzalcoatl growled, massive shoulders bunching as he prepared for a direct assault. I must stop them before they poison the well of spirits. But I knew that was exactly what Crawford wanted, to provoke the Guardian into close combat where his tranquilizer guns would be most effective. The sedatives they carried were derived from compounds found in the saliva of Komodo dragons, designed to bring down animals far larger than normal humans. Even Quetzalcoatl's enhanced physiology might not resist them for long. Instead, I opened myself fully to the forest's consciousness, letting my human awareness merge with the vast, slow thoughts of the mountains themselves. Through that connection, I could feel every disturbance in the valley's natural harmony, every place where the hunter's presence created discord in the ancient patterns. The solution came to me in a flash of inspiration that felt like a gift from my great-grandmother's spirit. Instead of fighting the hunters directly, I began to sing, not with my voice alone, but with the combined voices of every bird, every insect, every rustling leaf in the entire valley. The song was older than human language, a harmonic frequency that resonated with the deepest structures of reality. As it built in power and complexity, I felt the boundary between the hidden valley and the normal world beginning to shift. The hunters found themselves caught in a maze of twisted geography, where paths that led uphill somehow brought them deeper underground, and clearings that appeared 50 yards away proved impossible to reach. Crawford's team began to panic as their GPS units failed and their compasses spun wildly. The electronic equipment they'd relied on to track mystical energies now worked against them, broadcasting feedback loops that grew stronger with each passing minute. "Fall back," Crawford ordered, but his men discovered that retreat was no longer an option. The forest had become a living labyrinth that trapped intruders while allowing defenders to move freely between widely separated locations. It was then that Quetzalcoatl revealed the full extent of his power. Rising to his full height, he called out in the ancient language, and the very stones of the valley began to answer. What I had taken for natural rock formations were actually sleeping guardians, beings like himself who had chosen to merge so completely with the land that they appeared to be part of the geological structure. 7 massive forms emerged from cliff faces and boulder fields, stone giants with glowing eyes and voices like avalanches. They moved with slow, inexorable purpose toward the trapped hunters, who could only watch in terrified fascination as legends came to life around them. "Please," Sequoia called out, his betrayal forgotten in the face of powers he'd never imagined. I'm Cherokee. I'm family. Family protects family, Kegla Kudla replied sadly. You chose strangers' gold over your people's sacred trust. The ancestors will judge your actions in the spirit world, but even in victory, mercy tempered justice. The stone guardians could have crushed the intruders without effort, but instead they simply held them motionless while I worked to erase the electronic records of their expedition. Every photograph, every GPS coordinate, every sample they'd collected dissolved into dust as the forest reclaimed its secrets. Crawford and his team would return to the outside world with no evidence of what they'd discovered, their memories clouded by exposure to spiritual energies their minds couldn't process. They would remember a failed expedition, equipment malfunctions, and a vague sense that some places were too dangerous to explore. Only Sequoia faced a different fate. As the last descendant of the Cherokee who had originally negotiated the Guardian treaties, he would remain in the valley to atone for his betrayal. He would serve the Guardians until he earned redemption or chose to join them permanently in their timeless vigil. As dawn broke over the hidden valley, I stood with my companions watching the Stone Guardians return to their patient slumber. The immediate threat had passed, but I knew it would not be the last. As the outside world continued to encroach on the wild places, new challenges would emerge. What happens now? Sarah asked, her voice small in the vast quiet of the morning. I felt the weight of my new responsibilities settling around me like a comfortable cloak. Now we go back to the world and do what guardians have always done. Protect the balance between what was, what is, and what must be preserved for future generations. Thompson and Martinez would file reports about a successful rescue operation, leaving out any details that couldn't be explained through conventional means. The three hikers would return to their university with stories that would become the foundation for new research into indigenous folklore and environmental protection, and I would continue my work as a park ranger but with a deeper understanding of what I was truly protecting. The tourists and day hikers who visited my district would never know that their safety depended on treaties signed in blood and spirit smoke, or that the beautiful wilderness they admired was actively defended by guardians older than recorded history. As we prepared to leave the valley, Kekla Kudle placed one massive hand on my shoulder. Remember, young guardian, he said, the forest chooses its own. Your children and your children's children will walk these paths, and when the time comes, they too must choose between the easy road and the sacred duty. I touched the medicine pouch around my neck, feeling the new weight of responsibility it carried. My grandmother's voice whispered one last time in the morning wind. The circle continues, grandson. The ancient ways endure. Looking back at the hidden valley as we climbed toward the rim, I saw it beginning to fade from normal sight, returning to its state of spiritual concealment. To any future visitors, it would appear as nothing more than a steep ravine filled with ordinary trees and rocks. The secret would be safe for another generation, but I would return. As the seasons turned and the years passed, I would walk the spirit paths between worlds, maintaining the delicate balance that kept the sacred places hidden and the old guardians in their peaceful slumber. It was my heritage, my burden, and my honor. The forest had called, and I had answered. Now, like my ancestors before me, I would spend my life ensuring that the ancient covenant between the Cherokee people and the guardians of the wild places would never be broken. Behind us, as we emerged into the normal world of ranger stations and radio communications, the valley sang with the voices of countless spirits welcoming a new guardian to their eternal watch. The mountains themselves seemed to sigh with satisfaction knowing that their secrets would remain safe for at least another generation. My name is Amadahi, Forest Water, and I am the bridge between worlds. This is my story, and it is far from over. In the years that followed, Ranger Amadahai would become something of a legend among his colleagues for his uncanny ability to find lost hikers and his perfect safety record in the most dangerous sections of the park. Visitors would sometimes report seeing a tall figure moving through the forest with impossible silence, or hearing Cherokee songs echoing from empty valleys. The official records show no mention of missing persons cases that year, no unexplained phenomena, and certainly no encounters with cryptid creatures. But among the Cherokee families who still remember the old stories, they speak of Amadahi with respect and gratitude, knowing that he keeps the ancient promises their ancestors made to the guardians of the sacred places. And sometimes, on foggy mornings when the veil between worlds grows thin, park visitors report seeing massive footprints on remote trails, footprints that disappear before they can be photographed, leading always deeper into the wilderness where the oldest magic still holds sway. The guardians are watching, the covenant endures, and in the deepest parts of the Appalachian forest, where the streams run like silver through groves of ancient trees, the spirits of 7 generations of Cherokee protectors continue their eternal vigil. Some secrets are too important to be lost. Some places are too sacred to be found by those who would exploit them. And some stories, like this one, must be told to ensure that the next generation understands their responsibility to protect what their ancestors died to preserve. The forest remembers, the guardians endure, and somewhere in the hidden valleys of the Cherokee homeland, Amadehi walks the spirit path still, keeping watch over the boundary between the world of humans and the realm of ancient magic that pulses like a heartbeat beneath the roots of every tree. My name is Kanadi Wahia, first hunter wolf in the old tongue, though most folks just call me Kane. My great-grandmother gave me that name during my naming ceremony when I was 7 days old, as was our way. She said the spirits told her I would be a guardian of both the hunt and the hunted. I never understood what she meant until that October when the forest began to remember things that should have stayed buried. I've been a park ranger in the Nantahala National Forest for 15 years now, following trails that my Cherokee ancestors walked for 1,000 generations before the white settlers came. The mountains here hold secrets older than recorded history, and some of those secrets have teeth. It started with the Hendricks family, a father, mother, and their 8-year-old daughter Emma who'd gone missing 3 days ago during what should have been a simple day hike. Search and rescue had covered the marked trails twice, brought in dogs, even had a helicopter sweep the canopy. Nothing. It was like the forest had simply swallowed them whole. I was checking their last known location near Beach Creek when I found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The campsite looked normal enough at first glance: scattered sleeping bags, an overturned camp stove, the usual signs of people leaving in a hurry. But then I noticed the trees. 3 massive pines in a perfect triangle around the campsite had deep gouges carved into their bark, each mark exactly 8 feet off the ground. The cuts were fresh, sap still oozing down the trunk like amber tears. I've seen bear claws before. Hell, I've been close enough to black bears to count their teeth. These weren't bear marks. The gouges were too deep, too deliberate, and spaced too far apart for any creature I knew. But it was the smell that made my blood run cold. Underneath the pine scent and damp earth was something else, a musty, predatory stink that reminded me of the stories my grandfather used to tell around winter fires. Stories about the Kekla, the forest giant that walked between the worlds of the living and the dead. Just stories, I muttered to myself. But my hand instinctively went to the bone pendant my grandmother had given me, carved from the antler of a white deer and blessed with old words of protection. I was photographing the claw marks when I heard it. A low, rumbling call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The sound made my teeth ache and sent every bird within a quarter mile into panicked flight. That's when I saw the footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft earth beside the creek, filled with muddy water but unmistakably fresh. 22 inches long, nearly 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what looked like the remains of a heel pad. I've tracked everything from elk to black bears across these mountains, but this print belonged to something that had no business existing in the modern world. I called it into headquarters, my voice steadier than I felt. This is Ranger Wahia. I've found evidence at the Hendricks campsite, requesting backup and the specialized tracking team. The radio crackled with static before dispatch responded. Copy that, Kane. What kind of evidence are we talking about? I looked down at the massive footprint, then up at the claw marks scarring the ancient pines. How do you explain to someone that you've stumbled across proof of a legend? How do you tell them that the bedtime stories your grandmother whispered in Cherokee might have been warnings instead of folklore? Unidentified animal tracks, I said finally. Large predator, possibly responsible for the disappearance. That was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that my great-grandmother's stories were echoing in my head. Tales of the forest guardian that punished those who took more than they needed, who protected the sacred places from those who would defile them. As I waited for backup, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. Leading away from the campsite was a trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, as if something massive had passed through the forest carrying a heavy burden. But what made it truly terrifying was that the trail led directly toward the old-growth section of the forest, the part we designated as off-limits to hikers because of the unstable terrain. The part where my grandfather had always warned me never to go alone, especially after dark. The sun was already sinking behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. In Cherokee tradition, sunset was when the veil between worlds grew thin, when the spirits of the forest stirred to life. As darkness crept through the trees, I could feel something watching me from the shadows, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to follow that trail. Backup arrived just as the last light faded from the sky. 3 other rangers, 2 K9 units, and Detective Sarah Morrison from the County Sheriff's Department. I'd worked with Sarah before on missing person cases, and she had the kind of practical, no-nonsense attitude that usually kept her grounded in reality. Usually, Jesus Kane, she said, shining her flashlight on the massive footprint. What the hell made this? That's what we're here to find out, I replied. But I was watching the dogs. Both German shepherds were highly trained tracking animals, but they were acting strange. Instead of eagerly following the scent trail, they were whining and pulling away from the path that led deeper into the forest. Their handlers looked confused. Never seen them act like this, Officer Martinez said, trying to coax his dog forward. It's like they're afraid of something. Animals know things we've forgotten. My grandmother used to say that domestic animals could still sense the old spirits, the ones that predated human civilization. Looking at those dogs now, I believed her. We followed the trail by flashlight, moving in single file through increasingly dense undergrowth. The path, if you could call it that, led steadily upward toward the heart of the old-growth forest. Ancient hemlocks and chestnuts towered above us, their canopy so thick that even in daylight this place would be shrouded in permanent twilight. It was Ranger Collins who found the first piece of evidence. "Hey, over here," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the cathedral silence of the forest. Hanging from a branch about 7 feet off the ground was a torn piece of fabric, pink fleece with cartoon characters on it. Emma Hendricks had been wearing a pink jacket when they'd started their hike. "She's alive," Sarah said, bagging the evidence. Or at least she was when this got torn off. I wanted to share her optimism, but something about the way the fabric was positioned bothered me. It was hung deliberately, almost like a marker, like something was leaving us a trail to follow. We pressed deeper into the forest, finding more evidence as we climbed. A man's hiking boot, laces still tied. A water bottle with the family's last name written in permanent marker. Each item was placed conspicuously, easy to spot in our flashlight beams. "It's like they're breadcrumbs," Officer Martinez muttered. "Or bait," I said quietly, and Sarah gave me a sharp look. The trail ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, despite 15 years of patrolling these mountains. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter and scarred with decades of claw marks. But these weren't fresh gouges like the ones at the campsite. These were old, weathered, some of them so ancient they'd begun to heal over. "My God," Sarah breathed. "How long has something been coming here?" Before I could answer, we heard the scream. It came from somewhere ahead of us, high-pitched and terrified, definitely human. Emma Hendricks calling for help from deeper in the forest. Without thinking, Martinez and Collins took off running toward the sound, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they crashed through the underbrush. "Wait!" I shouted. But they were already gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. Sarah and I followed more cautiously, my grandmother's warnings echoing in my head. In the old stories, the forest giant was clever as well as strong. It could mimic human voices, lure people away from safety with the sounds of crying children or calls for help. We found Martinez first, standing motionless about 50 yards from the clearing. His flashlight hung loose in his hand, pointing at the ground, and he wasn't responding to our calls. "Martinez?" Sarah approached him carefully, her hand on her sidearm. "You okay, buddy?" When she touched his shoulder, he turned around slowly. His face was completely blank, eyes wide and staring at nothing. He looked like he was sleepwalking. "There's nothing there," he said in a monotone voice. "Nothing in the forest, nothing watching, nothing waiting." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was shock, had to be. People who encountered extreme trauma sometimes dissociated, became catatonic. But as I looked into Martinez's eyes, I saw something that made my blood freeze. His pupils were dilated to pinpricks despite the darkness around us. And reflected in those tiny black dots was something that didn't belong in his line of sight. The image of a massive, hairy figure standing directly behind us. I spun around, my own flashlight sweeping the forest behind us. Nothing, just trees and shadows and the oppressive weight of something vast and patient watching from the darkness. "Collins," I called out. "Where's Collins?" We found him 20 minutes later, or what was left of him. The body was suspended 15 feet up in an old-growth hemlock, wrapped in branches like a grotesque cocoon. From the ground it was barely visible, just another shadow among the needles and bark. Sarah had to turn away when we got him down. I'd seen death before, car accidents, hunting accidents, the occasional overdose in the campgrounds, but this was different. Collins hadn't just been killed. He'd been arranged, positioned with deliberate care, and written on his forehead in what looked like mud and pine needles was a symbol I recognized from my great-grandmother's stories. The mark of the Kekle, the forest guardian that protected the sacred places from those who would violate them. "Kane," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to get Martinez out of here. We need to call for backup, bring in the state police, maybe even the FBI." I nodded, but I was thinking about the legend my grandfather had told me. The story said that once the forest giant marked someone for violation of the sacred places, it wouldn't stop hunting until it had claimed all the trespassers. The Hendricks family had wandered into forbidden territory, and now the ancient guardian was awake. But according to the stories, there was one way to appease the creature. One way to stop the hunt before it claimed more innocent lives. The keeper of the old ways had to offer himself as a substitute, willingly walking into the forest giant's domain and accepting whatever judgment the spirits deemed appropriate. As we helped the catatonic Martinez back toward the trail, I fingered the bone pendant around my neck and made a decision that would either save the Hendricks family or add my name to the list of people who'd vanished forever in these ancient mountains. I waited until Sarah and Martinez reached the trailhead before I turned back toward the forest. The smart thing would have been to leave with them, call in the state police, and let someone else deal with whatever was hunting in these mountains. But the smart thing wasn't always the right thing, especially when you carried the blood of the people who'd walked these ridges long before they had names on any map. My great-grandmother had taught me the old stories for a reason. She'd known that someday I'd need to understand the difference between legend and living truth. I walked back to the ancient oak with its decades of claw marks, my flashlight beam dancing across scars that told the history of every encounter between the forest guardian and those foolish enough to trespass in sacred territory. At the base of the tree, I knelt and placed my hands flat against the earth. "Kakle Kudle," I said in Cherokee, using the words my grandmother had taught me. "Ancient protector of the sacred places, I am Kanati Wahia, descendant of those who honored the old agreements. I come seeking balance." The forest fell completely silent. No wind through the leaves, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, not even the distant hum of insects. It was like the entire mountain was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps. They came from directly behind me, slow and deliberate, each one shaking the ground like a small earthquake. I forced myself not to turn around, not to reach for the service weapon on my hip. This wasn't a confrontation that would be settled with bullets. The footsteps stopped just behind me. I could feel body heat radiating against my back, could smell that musty, wild scent that spoke of deep forests and older times. When the creature finally spoke, its voice was like distant thunder. "You know the old words, small keeper. But do you know the price of speaking them?" I'd expected many things, but not this. The legends spoke of a mindless beast, a force of nature that killed without thought or reason. This was something else entirely, ancient, intelligent, and infinitely patient. "I know the stories," I said, still not turning around. "I know that the families of those who violate sacred places must pay for their transgression. But I also know that the old agreements allowed for substitution." The creature was quiet for a long moment. Then I heard something that chilled me to the bone. Laughter, low and rumbling like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "The families," it said. "Yes, they must pay. But tell me, small keeper, who violated the sacred places first? Who brought machines to cut the ancient trees? Who built roads through burial grounds and called it progress?" I finally understood. The Hendricks family wasn't the primary target. They were just the latest in a long line of trespassers, the final straw that had awakened something that had been sleeping for decades while its forest was slowly carved away by development and tourism. "Where are they?" I asked. "The family. Are they still alive?" "The young one lives. The others..." The creature's voice trailed off into something that might have been regret. "The guardian does not enjoy necessary deaths, small keeper, but the sacred places must be protected. Let me see her. Let me take the child back to her people, and I'll help you find another way to protect what's sacred." For the first time since this began, I turned around to face the legend that had haunted Cherokee stories for generations. The Keklikudla stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body covered in coarse, dark fur that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. Its face was almost human but stretched and distorted, with intelligent eyes that reflected centuries of watching his forest shrink and change. This wasn't a monster, it was a refugee, the last guardian of a world that was rapidly disappearing. "You would bargain for the lives of those who defile the sacred places?" it asked. "I would honor the old agreements while finding a new way forward," I said. "The forest still needs protection, but killing families won't bring back what's been lost." The creature studied me for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, it nodded toward a path I hadn't noticed before, one that led deeper into the trees. The young one waits in the place of judgment. Come, small keeper, see what your people's progress has wrought. We walked together through the midnight forest. The legendary guardian and the park ranger, two remnants of older times trying to find a bridge between the world that was and the world that is. The path led to a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, surrounded by trees so ancient they must have been saplings when Cherokee villages first dotted these mountains. Emma Hendricks sat in the center of the clearing, alive but clearly traumatized. When she saw me, she scrambled to her feet and ran toward my flashlight beam. Mister, help me! There's a monster in the woods. I caught her in my arms, this 8-year-old girl who'd been alone in the forest for 3 days with something out of nightmares. But as I held her, I realized something that changed everything. She wasn't hurt. Scared, yes, but not injured. Someone, or something, had been taking care of her. The young one is innocent, the Kekle Kudle said from the shadows. She did not choose to come to the sacred places. She will be returned to her people, as will you, small keeper. But there must be understanding. Over the next hour, as Emma slept in my jacket and the ancient guardian watched over us both, I learned the truth about the disappearances that had plagued these mountains for decades. The creature wasn't a mindless killer. It was a desperate protector, watching its domain shrink year by year as development crept closer to the most sacred sites. Every family that had vanished had unknowingly camped in areas that were off-limits according to agreements signed between the Cherokee Nation and the U.S. government more than a century ago. Agreements that had been forgotten or ignored as new generations took over the management of the forest. There is a place, the creature told me as dawn began to filter through the canopy. A valley where the oldest trees grow, where the burial grounds of your ancestors rest undisturbed. It is marked on none of your maps, protected by none of your laws. Soon the tree killers will come for it. I understood. The logging companies had been eyeing the old growth sections for years, waiting for the right political climate to push through their permits. The Kekle Kudla was running out of forest to protect. What if we could change that? I asked. What if we could make those places truly protected, legally and permanently? The ancient guardian was quiet for a long moment. Then it nodded slowly. If the sacred places are protected by the law words of your people, the guardian's hunt will end. The old agreements will be honored in new ways. As the sun rose over the Nantahala mountains, I carried Emma Hendricks out of the forest while behind us. Something ancient and patient melted back into the shadows between the trees. She would tell people about the monster in the woods, but children's stories are easy to dismiss as trauma and imagination. I, on the other hand, had work to do. Calls to make to the Cherokee Nation's legal department, documents to research, environmental protection laws to invoke. The creature had shown me maps carved into trees and stone markers hidden by decades of growth, evidence of the original territorial agreements that had never been formally revoked. 6 months later, the Nantahala Valley Preservation Area was officially designated as protected Cherokee cultural land, off-limits to development in perpetuity. The disappearances stopped. The claw marks on the trees began to fade. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm patrolling the forest roads, I catch a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. But it's not hunting anymore. It's just watching, protecting, being the guardian these mountains have always needed. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of ancient places, I hear a voice like distant thunder saying words of gratitude in a language older than recorded history. The forest remembers everything, including those who choose to honor the old agreements in new ways.